Hello, and welcome to the Super 70 Podcast, Episode 19, Kingdom of Heaven. The Super 70 is a commentary meant to sync with the film we are discussing. You don't have to, though, and can go on listening without watching anything. I would, however, recommend that you watch the film we are discussing before listening to the Super 70 Podcast. You can find it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, Himalaya, Pocket Cast, and my website at www.thatdylandavis.com. I'm Dylan Davis. We will be using the 194-minute version of Kingdom of Heaven on Vudu.com and marked as the director's cut. It was released in a 4-DVD set in 2005 in companion with the initial theatrical release on DVD at the same time. Make sure you have the correct version or the sync will be off in minutes. If you are using the DVD version, please remember that the version is split at the interact on 2 DVDs, and you will need to pause the podcast when the interact occurs. If you are watching the Vudu version of the film, be aware of the overture and the interact, which will automatically appear at the beginning and the middle of the film. If you are using the DVD, Ridley Scott introduces the film in 1 minute and 2-second explanation. In this case, you should go to the Scenes menu and start at the overture, Chapter 1, so the sync will work. If you press play on either Vudu or your DVD scene chapter now, this podcast should sync with the rest of the film. Overtures were big back in the 1950s and 60s when Hollywood was putting out these huge sword and sandal epics like Cleopatra and Ben-Hur. A big one is the Fall of the Roman Empire. Overtures were meant to emphasize the music in the beginning of the film, and the interact was supposed to give people the chance to run to the bathroom or grab more popcorn. The last interact I saw was last night, Lawrence of Arabia, the 60th anniversary, or 65th, or whatever the hell anniversary it was. Luke and I went to go see it. And I saw one for Gettysburg that was 30 minutes, which I needed because that movie was literally 4 hours long. This overture is supposed to mimic the vocals and the basic music of medieval Europe. Everything in Europe at the time was dominated by religion, in Western Europe, especially France, where the Kingdom of Heaven starts, was completely dominated by the Roman Catholic Church. And the church, or we should say faith, was the inspiration of most of the music that survives from this period. And most music from the churches came from the choir. The monasteries were great sources of music. The Benedictine monks of Santo Domingo even won a Grammy about 30 years ago for chants that they did. Even the string instruments you hear in the soundtrack of the Kingdom of Heaven are inspired by the wooden lyres available back then. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dave Anderson is back in his house, or as I like to refer to him in my study in my podcast studio, the Hacienda. Welcome back, Dave.
Well, thank you very much. I am thrilled and honored to be invited back after the last time. Hopefully it was good enough. Apparently it was, crossing fingers. And a marked improvement will occur this time.
Oh, I hope so. I hope the feedback issue is solved.
Yes, I don't think it'll be an issue at all.
Okay, so I first saw Kingdom of Heaven in the theater the first weekend it came out, and I got to tell you, I was not impressed.
That's the understanding I have had. I have not seen the original theatrical cut, so I have no frame of reference beyond what I've heard. I remember buying this DVD when it came out primarily because there was so much acclaim around the longer version relative to the original theatrical. So it's like piqued my interest, but I've never seen the original theatrical. So it must be cut to shreds, but like I said, not actually seeing it, I'm working on an assumption or Bates knowledge from the internet.
Right. Now, I love Ridley Scott, but he's been real inconsistent.
Exceptionally so.
Yes.
And I think this movie is like a perfect encapsulation of that.
Right.
Because it's remarkably inconsistent.
Yes. Yeah. Now, he's the first director that I returned to on the Super 70 podcast. I did Blade Runner for my first episode.
Makes sense.
He did G.I. Jane in 1997 with Demi Moore and Michael Biehn, who was in The Terminator and Aliens, and the sequel to Scott's first film. Hannibal was a shit show in 2001.
That was, don't even want to think about it.
Black Hawk Down with Orlando Bloom came out the same year.
Enjoyed that quite a bit.
Fantastic film. Noted for one of the most accurate displays of a historical event actually on film.
Okay.
Completely opposite of Kingdom of Heaven. Now, perhaps one of the greatest war films ever made. Then Matchstick Men in 2003 is arguably the last good Nicolas Cage film.
I'd have to think about that. I hope that's not the case.
And then Kingdom of Heaven in 2005. he's always been up and down. It's frustrating, and we should get together and talk about his other films and maybe another special report that we do after this. But when he's on his game, his results are amazing. And I got to tell you, I hated this in the theater. And we'll go into why along the way when we do this scene by scene. But I was not a fan. And I asked you after the Terminator podcast, because if you haven't noticed, the second decade of my podcast is one film representing one decade of American history. And I asked you what film should represent 2000 to 2010, and you said Kingdom of Heaven, and I really took a pause.
Well, that's reasonable. I primarily recommended it to you based on knowing you personally and your great interest in history. And also I figured it was somewhat outside the box.
Oh, very much so.
So I was like, okay, this is an interesting thing to see, because it's not like I hear about this movie with any degree of regularity. So I thought you just might find it interesting. I didn't know that you'd actually seen the theatrical in the theaters.
Right. Yeah. So actually, the story behind the rotten fruit, obviously, is Europe is rotten to the core. That's what I took from that, pulling the maggot out of the fruit. So what had happened was I took the XSET test to be a teacher in the state of Texas, and my results were due at 1 o'clock on a Saturday, and Kingdom of Heaven had came out on the Friday. So I, rather than sit and stew and wait for the results to come in, because I did not know if I was going to have a job by 1 o'clock that afternoon, I went to go see Kingdom of Heaven, and it sucked bad. And so I came back. I was not in a good mood, and my wife had in the garage where I parked my car. My wife had actually put a note up on the door saying "You passed" right when I came in the garage.
Yeah, so that was a bit of good news after this.
After this, for sure. So you gave me a copy of the director's cut, which I didn't even know existed.
That's actually really surprising.
Yeah, and I watched it up in my movie theater upstairs. And I have to say, I was completely blown away. I was really impressed by the difference between the two versions, which is not marginal by any sense of the imagination.
That is my understanding.
The scope and the ambition of the film is just completely different. It's a different movie, and I'm glad you brought it, and I'm glad I watched it and agreed to this, that it should be in the next decade. However, I've done a lot of research on this, and I got a lot of crap from the Crusades in my head. I must have read about 3 or 4 books, about 20 articles on it. I've seen the director's cut many times, and my opinion on it has changed. I don't think it's the disaster that the first cut is, but I've got some definite historical issues with it. So here we are watching The Kingdom of Heaven. So when did you first see it?
Oh, I think I saw it when it came out on DVD.
Okay.
So when did you say that was? 2010? No,
2005.
2005. Oh, geez, I'm off by half a decade. So, I think we'll definitely watch this movie from 2 differing perspectives, right? You're going to be much more interested and guided by the historical accuracies, or not so much as. And to me, that isn't all that relevant. I'm mostly going to, I watch it for, does it tell a good tale? Right? Is it, interesting? Does it captivating, compelling? You name it. Things like that from strictly the movie standpoint.
Check all 3 boxes. I mean, really, it is all those things.
It is many of those things, yeah.
Yeah. Now, this is Spain, right? So simply an amazing shot, amazing title card.
Oh, yeah.
Landscape of Spain. They shot the entire film in Spain and Morocco, including all the studio sequences. There are many references to the Kingdom of Heaven in the Bible, but the one that I found that relates the most is Matthew 7:21, which reads, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven."
Okay.
Also Matthew 5:20, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." So it's fitting that we start the story in France, because the great majority of the first Crusaders were French.
Okay.
This was actually a France that was not actually France yet. Like, they had a king, but not all of France as we know it today was in the kingdom of France. So they were actually called the Franks. And all of the ruling aristocracy in the Latin kingdom were French or descendants of the French, 1 or 2 generations removed. And France at the time was the dominant country in all of Europe, despite not being all together. Half of France was actually the personal property of the King of England. But he was French, and he spoke French, and he spoke English as well, but just the kings of England spoke French for 100 years after the Plantagenets died out. So most of the kings of England would not spend too much time actually in England until King John got kicked out of France in the 1200s, which is after the Battle of Hattin. So... sorry, I'm having flashbacks of Robin Hood, and I'm waiting for Morgan Freeman to show up any now.
Well, to a certain degree, the character does.
Yeah, so we already passed Michael Sheen. who plays a priest, and supposedly he's a brother or a half-brother of Balian.
Yes, he's apparently a half-brother, which is part of the problem I have with the movie, even in its extended form, is that the relationships are not immediately clear, and I don't need to be banged over the head with why people do things or what the relationships are, but it's pretty obscured in this movie oftentimes. Like, who exactly is that? Why does this person matter?
Yeah, who's the father? And
right.
All of that.
Why is there this great conflict? It's, like I said, it's not critical that they have to show the whole Cain and Abel back history that this person is bad and this is what he wants, but it is one of those that's almost irrational of the amount of apparent love that the village has for the Orlando Bloom character and why the priest despises him so much. I'm sure there's a backstory written down somewhere.
Yeah, there's got to be. And the stuff flying around here, and I know that you've seen a dozen Ridley Scott films like I have, but, you know, it reminded me of Legend. Like, I remember Ridley Scott's Legend, or just with Tom Cruise, and stuff flying in the air all the time.
All the time.
He loves having fans right off the camera.
Yes.
Okay, so Michael Sheen, like I was saying before this there was not much. The Four Feathers in 2002, Underworld in 2003, Timeline in 2003. After this, he famously played Tony Blair in The Queen in 2006. He's been in every Underworld sequel since, but I only know him from Tron Legacy.
Oh, okay.
So the priest is hungry. He's opportunistic. He's an asshole. He's a brother of Balian. Is the brother evil or jealous? Is jealousy an evil? That's what I got out of that.
Right. And he certainly is, but it's unclear as to why.
Yeah.
To me, I just don't get it. It's like, okay, he is a bad seed because he is. Right.
No, I mean, I obviously took it as, and we know that this was a huge problem after 600 or 700 straight years of Catholicism just having a stranglehold on the lay people of Europe. There were bad seeds.
Oh, absolutely.
In the church, and that was part of the reason for the Crusades and the Reformation that followed and all of that. But I thought it was a very, you know, this film,
Jamie Lannister.
Yeah, Jamie Lannister. Yeah, and Lupin, Remus Lupin. I thought this was very unkind to the first priest you saw as a bad seed, and of course the Patriarch of Jerusalem is just a total dick.
Yes,
and it's very. I mean, with the exception of the Hospitaller, which is played by David Thewlis, with the exception of him and some others. I mean, Balian, of course, is a great example of a very devout Christian. There's not very very good examples of clergy in the entire film.
No, but there's not a whole lot of great depictions of people throughout the whole movie. I guess let me retract that. That's actually inaccurate. But I think based on, you know, like I said, I'm not the history, you know, buff knowledge king that you are. But, I mean, establishing the churches with a specific, you know, identity, ideology, and why people do things. Okay, that makes sense from a story point standpoint. Okay, we're going to have these people be avatars, and this is why they're doing things, because the church wills it, et cetera, or in this creep's mind, you know, I think he's primarily using his power as a priest just to get what he wants. Yeah. Which is very unclear as to what he wants, aside from whatever his brother has, but it doesn't look like he's been deprived of really anything.
Yeah.
That wasn't his own choice, presumably.
Well, I would hope and think so, but it's just the way that he's taunting him here. I mean, we all have, most of us have siblings.
Yes,
but that goes beyond the pale for me to say, you know, how he's treating his brother over his wife's death is. I won't say that it never happened. It just seems
it's over the top more than just plain bullying.
Right. Now, okay. This is our first departure from history, and I'm going to try to make this as concise as possible, and I'm going to asterisk everything with I am not a medieval historian. I am degreed trained historian, though, and I know how to research, so I researched this after you recommended it to me, and we'll start with the general overview just for our listeners. Very quickly, the Pope of the Catholic Church, Urban II, gave a speech to the aristocracy of France at the Council of Clermont in 1095, and it was more like a sermon, actually. And he called on the French aristocracy to organize an attempt to take the Holy Land back from the Muslims, who had taken modern-day Israel, or if you care, what is today Palestine, or what we commonly call the Holy Land, or the Levant, or whatever, in the 700s. So by the First Crusade, the Muslims had occupied the Levant for about 3 centuries. So to start off with this idea that somehow Christians were taking it back is kind of skewed to begin with. Muslims had taken it before the Crusaders, and the Byzantines had taken it before the Muslims, but the pagans had it before the Byzantines, and then the Jews had it before the pagans, and the Palestinians had it before then, and then the Egyptians. So we're talking about a contested part of the earth here that is really hard to pin down, and it's very hard to say that struggle is over.
Oh, absolutely.
We're still dealing with the after effects of the partition.
Just people being people.
Right, yeah. So we have scenes here that all is not well in Christendom and the corruption of the priest. By the time of the Crusades, Christianity was 1,000 years old, and in the Western Roman Empire, it was really only about 500 years old. Constantine did not pass the Edict of Milan until 313 AD, which is confused in school. It's mistaught. It's not a law that makes Christianity the state religion of Rome. It's an edict of toleration. Mm-hmm. So we're going to tolerate Christians, not necessarily accept them, because by 300, they're everywhere.
Right.
And you can't get rid of them. He also built the first church of the Holy Sepulchre, which, by the way, is where Christ's body is supposedly entombed, if you're not into the whole Christian thing. The last pagan emperor was Julian, who died in 363, and after that, paganism is on the decline. Rome is sacked several times, but 546 is the last date where Rome is basically effectively destroyed and ceases to be an empire in the West. The star power of Orlando Bloom, my friend: Fellowship of the Ring, 2001, Black Hawk Down, 2001, Pirates of the Caribbean, 2003, Troy, 2004. He's primed for this.
Yes.
Other than the pirate movies, he's floundered since Kingdom of Heaven, I think.
Oh, yeah, he has not made a significant impact on the viewing public, I wouldn't say. And I mean, even in this movie, I don't find him a very compelling protagonist, from the way he plays it. It's pretty, frankly, dull.
Yeah. It seems rather flat.
He doesn't have a lot of charisma.
Right. I mean, he comes across as devout.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Which is probably true to the way they wanted to play it. It makes sense.
Right.
But it's not necessarily compelling watching.
Yes. Yeah, I would say so.
Not a lot of, passion, if you will. Right.
Now, Balian of Ebelane was actually... Oh, my God. I want to get into some of these details that are just quite crazy. But he was actually born in the Levant. His father was Baldwin of Ebelane. Baldwin was actually born in France. So there's part of this is true and part of this is not. So
it's inspired by a true story.
Right. It's inspired by, yeah. So the Ebelin family was actually like a very influential family in the kingdom of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And they centered their power in a castle called Nablus, Nablus. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I'm not going to call you on it if you're not.
Yeah. But Balian himself was already married. He married the Dowager Queen of the Byzantine Empire.
Okay.
So her name was actually Queen Maria. So just to offset this, like, Balian was not a blacksmith. Mm-hmm. He was not born in France. He did not go on crusade. He was born in the Levant, and he was married to somebody else. So he wasn't skirt chasing the sister of the king of Jerusalem. They take a lot of license with it. Like, Liam Neeson is supposed to be his father, but his name is Godfrey, not Baldwin. So just immediately, like, if you're reading histories and you're trying to catch up on the Latin Kingdom because you find this a fascinating movie, you get very easily confused.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. And the screenwriter is a very talented screenwriter. God, what's his name? I swore I was going to put him IMDb up.
Now, okay, so... I'm sorry, I'm going to use the actors' names as opposed to the characters.
Yeah.
So, does Orlando Bloom know that Liam Neeson is his father prior to? Does he know that he's a bastard before this moment?
I think he knows he's a bastard. I don't think that he knows who his father is.
Right. So, I wasn't sure on this. It's presented as if it's a surprise, but at the same time, he doesn't react as if it's a shock to him.
I think he's surprised that is his father.
Right. And that I understand.
Yeah,
but
he's never met him before. That's what I got out of it. He's never met his father.
He emotes like a mother, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And Orlando Bloom doesn't do a bad job in this movie, I don't think. But I think he does it to the best of his abilities, and I think his abilities appear to be sort of muted.
Well, he's a good actor.
Yeah, he's good.
And he's acted in other films perfectly fine. I think that we're seeing here is the effects of the direction.
Probably. It seems
right?
accurate.
I mean, because we know that he can act. He plays completely different characters in other movies. Black Hawk Down, even though he's only in it for about 15, 20 minutes,
right?
Is entirely different character. He's the kid who falls off the chopper in the beginning. Liam Neeson, on the other hand, here is throwing all kinds of emotions.
Well, and also, but it's understated, but it's got a lot of power to it. You know, he's no histrionics or anything, but you can tell that he's processing the reactions or lack thereof. And he's just, in my opinion, just such a better actor. It's absurd.
You're right, Liam Neeson.
Yes.
Yes. No, without a doubt. William Monahan was the writer of The Kingdom of Heaven.
Okay.
And he was writing a script for Ridley Scott called Tripoli, which is about the American war against the Barbary pirates.
I would have much preferred to watch that movie.
Yeah, in the early 1800s.
That would have been pretty cool.
Yeah, and apparently they were in pre-production, and they had a start date, and they were creeping towards the front of it, and the production company, and I can't remember which one it was, just decided they were going to pull the plug.
And then they decided to take this one on as an easier alternative?
Yes. Yeah. They did, to the point to where they actually used some of the same stuff. Like, we'll use the same production design for The Village, for example. We're just going to give it a different color tone.
Sure. That actually makes sense.
Right.
But it's one of those, I mean, no matter what, reading about how this movie was made has to be a fascinating story, because it's definitely a lot of moving parts. You know, I don't know what percentage of it is very early primitive CGI, but I'm sure all the soldiers in the background, those are all real extras, I'm guessing.
No, they're all...
No, really?
It's a computer-generated... Yeah, it's a really good computer-generated
It's really well done.
modeling. Yeah. No, it is. And we'll get into particularly in the Battle of Hattin, it's done very well. And all of that... I have to say, the quality, the production design...
Yeah, technically it's really well done.
And Ridley Scott does not let you down on that. Like, I could not stand Prometheus. I hated Prometheus. But if you want to look at production quality, Prometheus is
really outstandingly done.
Absolutely. It's an outstandingly done bad movie.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's an idea. Baleen is going to go to Jerusalem to counter his wife's sin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We have to deal with that.
How so? I mean, it makes sense considering the time, the beliefs. You know, it's a great opportunity for him to get away from his past and think that he's doing something greater than himself.
Certainly.
Or are you talking about...
No, I'm not. I don't have any tricks or cards up,
right. No,
up my
no,
sleeve.
I know.
It's kind of like, I've got a cousin who went to West Point and went to Iraq, and he's actually a chaplain now.
Okay.
He went to theological seminary. And he really, really felt like, as an officer in the U.S. Army, he was part of the problem. Like, he was part of, I broke Iraq, and it's also my job to fix it.
Okay.
So when he went back for his second tour, that was his mindset. If I have to fix what we broke.
Okay.
And, it's very easy for other people to criticize that.
Sure.
It's very easy to jump into... there are people who are running this country who think of themselves as the Christian saviors of the world, and we go into a Muslim country and we fuck it up, and then now we have this mindset of we have to save it in a very like parental form.
Yeah,
and I can see how that would be just extremely insulting on the Muslim side of things.
I'm sure to some of them it is, and some of them not so much.
Right. Or you could.
I understand in Iraq they did, from a general standpoint, they didn't want them to leave.
Right, for a very long time.
It's like, no, Americans don't take office.
Just yet. Yeah. Right. But this is a penitential war. So some critics attacked that during the First Crusade. But when it succeeded, the idea that you could work off your sins in the Holy Land was very persuasive.
Yes, I can see where it would be.
Yeah, so there was also this very unique idea that if you did something absolutely...
there's a reason why Jesus is very persuasive.
Yes, right. Yeah. Yeah, the message was overpowering.
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, I can... Especially, well... back in the day, when, it would have sucked. Yeah, yes. So some kind of hope for redemption and paradise, because everything at the time sucked a lot.
Right. And we talked before about how redemption as an original message in the Western civilization is a redeeming factor that is probably one of the reasons why the West has been so, quote-unquote, successful.
I wouldn't put quotes around it. It's been very successful.
It's been very, well, yeah,
objectively.
Yes, the past 1,000 years has been very good to us, particularly the last 500.
Sure.
But so
I don't know if that's necessarily the reason why, but I was just saying.
Right, yeah. That's a point of view. So there's this very unique idea that if you did something absolutely unforgivable, the local lord or even the bishop could tell you, listen, if you go spend the rest of your life in Outremer, and the Outremer was the French word for the French lands in the Levant.
Okay.
It basically meant those lands overseas. And especially if you die fighting for God, then you're all good. Don't worry about heaven, but you can't stay here. So in a sense, the Outremer was taking in a lot of these cases. And it's hard to say it, but a lot of these guys, according to the church at least, were criminals.
Yes.
In the employ of aristocrats who were being forced out or lured out of Europe by riches. And the easiest thing that you could do, actually, is to join an order, like the Templars or the Hospitallers. And the orders did not report to a traditional lord. They were established orders of the Vatican. Like the Templars, for example, their job was to protect the temple in Jerusalem and to protect the pilgrimage caravans. That way you didn't have to go fight for a noble who didn't necessarily care about you. So Templars, warrior monks, poverty, chastity, obedience. This represented a great revival of faith during the Crusades, as we see, Hospitallers on the screen right now.
Right. And I don't mean to totally make this go off track from, where you're going with it.
Sure.
But this scene and this whole segment here, I find is a real problem with the movie.
Oh.
Because, in my opinion, it is filled with the most interesting characters, and people that I wanted to get to know more about. And since I'd forgotten about most of this movie by the time I'd seen it again, I found it really disappointing that a lot of what I found the initially very interesting characters were, killed off almost immediately.
Like Thor standing over there.
Correct. Or the Moor.
Yeah.
Or even Liam Neeson, to a certain degree, gets taken out at this point. He's never much else in this movie. That's not accurate, of course, but from an action standpoint, he's not. So, and I found this really interesting, and I enjoyed it. Oh, and the Englishman.
Yeah.
Who?
David Thewlis?
No, not David Thewlis, but that guy.
Yeah.
He's one of those guys.
Yeah, he's one of those guys.
He's one of those guys.
Yeah, that's
he's still in it beyond this, but the character is really marginalized and then presumably dies off screen in the Great Storm sequence.
Oh, right, yeah, on the ship.
So I just found this very unfortunate. It's like, okay, they're really starting to build something, and then, you have the chaos of war and ugliness, and Jaime Lannister gets it, but it just takes out a lot of the interesting characters in my mind for really no significant gain.
That's a very good point. Yeah, the band is broken up before,
like
before
immediately.
the show starts.
Right, because it was one of those, you could see a really fascinating movie about this group of people going down to the Holy Lands, and then, if they need to perish to further the story, then it totally makes sense. But it almost doesn't serve the story here.
Yeah, does it serve the story? That's a good question.
So I'm not really sure why it happened like this.
No, that's a good point. I never really thought about that. I just accepted as Balian did not have to arrive in the Levant with a blank check. He could have a blank slate, I should say.
Well, even then, okay, you have Liam Neeson get his mortally wounded during this sequence, and he passes that on. But then he has this crew that knows him and trusts him and supports him. It would have made that buy-in period when he enters the Holy Land a little bit more believable as well.
Yeah.
As opposed to the eye color and height.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point.
So that's why I was going from a storytelling standpoint. It just struck me as dissatisfying. It was a really good action sequence, for sure. But like I said, you don't need them all to be red shirts. Yep. Right. Speaking of red shirts.
Yeah, speaking of red shirts, yeah. Although that scene of Liam Neeson teaching, or Baldwin teaching Balian how to hold a sword in combat, particularly as Neeson is so huge.
He's a large
just
man.
A tall dude holding that. It's not a claymore, but damn, it's close. It's very now. Also another thing that was cut out of the original, which I found in the director's cut, and they talk about.
So yeah, is this actually in the theatrical, or is it?
Yeah, it is. It is. It's much shorter.
Is it pretty truncated?
And I mean, him crossing the horse. I don't think that was in the original,
which is admittedly pretty clever.
But there was a very remarkable piece of dialogue that was cut out, and it was when they were still in the village, where Balian was actually saying about how he had actually fought in war before for a lord, although for a cause he did not know or remember or even care about.
Explains why he's fairly skilled at killing right now.
Right, yeah. That explained. I do remember watching the fight scene to begin with, like, oh, wow, he's really handy with a sword really fast after his training.
Yes.
Right. This guy fighting with an arrow through his neck is just... There was a quick cut there that was kind of cheating on Scott's part, but whatever. So what the hell was this guy in? Now that you pointed it out, he's got the Joey Pants Award, I guess.
Well, he was in the HBO show Rome. That's where I know him from.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, no, he was one of the...
he was pretty much the lead character on that
Centurions,
show.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think he was in something else, but I don't honestly know what it is.
Man.
Which, that was a tremendous show, and I was very disappointed when they canceled it early.
Yeah. No,
okay,
that's okay. Balian being a bastard, he's ripe for time in Outremer, because you are talking about an area that's run by second sons, second brothers,
general outcasts.
Right, a society that really had nothing to sit for in Europe, except for waiting for an older person to die. And I read a complete history of the Crusades, and I read a book on Hattin. And then something else, feudalism in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And they are all filled with, particularly when Sibylla of Jerusalem comes of age. It's like, who the hell are we going to marry her off to?
Right.
She was married 3 times. So Guy de Lusignan was her second husband. And it was a huge, because life in Outremer was so harsh. The life expectancy was almost like 30% lower if you were serving in the Outremer than if you were serving if you lived in Europe. And
which is not like Europe was known for the really old dudes at the time.
No, not at all. And I would imagine, I haven't looked it up, but I'd imagine it'd be longer in Japan or China or India. Or
potentially.
I just don't know.
Oh, I'm sure life wasn't a lot easier in those parts of the world either.
No, I'm sure until modern times.
Correct.
Right.
Till, like, I don't know, penicillin.
Yeah. So this is the first Hollywood film that really deals with religious issues, and I mean Christian-Muslim conflict, after 9/11. And I was really surprised when I heard that Ridley Scott was doing a film on the Crusades. I was surprised that a film like that got greenlit. Yeah,
it is one of those things where at the time it would be shocking. I don't really honestly recall this really even coming out to a certain degree, right? Because there wasn't the internet like we know it now, where everything is interconnected, and we didn't have smartphones. We had these things called flip phones, and they worked fine. But you couldn't get a lot of your day-to-day information that you desperately need at the time. But no, you're right. It is one of those things where it's pretty admirable that they would even try to do something like this, where you have a lot of shades of gray throughout the entire movie. Because it would have been very easy to, color any particular group as god-awful, except, well, the Templars, of course, are not portrayed all that, what's the right word? Nicely. It's not the right word, but...
Yeah. No, the orders are definitely...
But most everybody else is a fleshed out 2, if not 3-dimensional human, which is, pretty admirable.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure that this would be the movie that it is without 9/11. Like, I know that William Monahan was working on the script for a very long time before 9/11.
You think so? I mean, it's...
Well, he was.
No. The statement about it being greatly affected by 9/11.
Yeah, I think the portrayal of the Christians and the Muslims is deliberately painted in a certain light due to 9/11, and that was one of the criticisms of the film. But there's some things that don't make sense, like the very word itself, Crusades. Like this is not a crusade film. No,
it is not.
That's not accurate. There's not a crusade.
It happens during that general period of time in our brains, but
right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's at this point, the first crusade has been over by 75 years. The second crusade happened. There's Guy de Lusignan. The second crusade happens, I think, it's 1110 or 1120, and that fails to retake Edessa, which is taken by Salah-al-Din's great uncle or something, if I remember correctly. And so the word crusade is tainted. Now, modern Christians have a rather positive view of the word about what Muslims attribute to the word jihad. That's a crusade. So the word just has bad press in the Arab world.
Sure.
Like the word jihad has bad press in the Christian world.
Correct.
George Bush famously used the word crusade to describe America's war on Al-Qaeda, and that was a huge blunder because the Arab world got a hold of that word and just went bonkers over it. So this is really embarrassing because George Bush was a history major at Yale.
Right.
And he should know better. But someone had to school him on not using that word, and when no president has used it since.
Even our current one, who will say almost anything at any given time? It's rather shocking, frankly.
Yeah. You mentioned the Templars. By the way, the white cross the red cross on the white just means that you are going on crusade. The white cross on the black means you're a hospitaller. And then there's a separate symbol for the temple.
Oh, I thought it was like a target.
Oh, yeah. Certainly so. And this scene here, like this shot here, like, oh my God, man. And I'm sure that there's CGI in it, but it's breathtaking.
Oh, yeah, no, the cinematography is phenomenal. It's like every other Ridley Scott movie. It is always just gorgeous to look at, and oftentimes they work better as silent films.
Yeah. Well, now that's a good point.
But yeah, it's always shockingly beautiful, and when he passes away, it's going to be unfortunate because he is not unique, but he is certainly gifted.
Yeah. A lot of these scenes were actually shot in the Alhambra, which is a palace in Madrid, which the Muslims built during the time where they were running Spain for 300 or 400 years before the Reconquista. And my wife and I actually went there when we visited Spain, I think in 2000. And the Alhambra is just utterly amazing. If you ever get the chance, it's
Go
very
check it
strong.
out.
Go check it out. And of course, Ferdinand and Isabel added to it, and every generation since then has put a courtyard off here and there and everywhere. And it's a sprawling complex of just amazing things. I was actually amazed that they were able to go in there and shoot it because it's a museum.
Gotcha.
Right. But when I saw that in the special edition, because I watched everything that you gave me.
You watched all 4 discs.
Yeah, I was like, oh, wow.
Listen to the commentary.
Yes, I did. Okay.
All right, to get back on track.
I don't remember where we were. So Balin gets ready to go on the crusade, and we talked about how the second crusade has failed. The Europeans are very, very skeptical of going on crusade after the fall of Edessa.
But there was always Midland.
Yes. And because of that failure, there was a shortage of pilgrims and a shortage of crusaders. And this really hurt the Latin kingdom because they needed that influx of people and money. And we can look at the Latin kingdom like a disassociated colony of France, particularly, and it couldn't survive on its own. One of the amazing things we'll talk about later is Henry II, who was King of England. Remember, he got into a spat with Thomas A. Becket, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yes.
Becket winds up
I do remember that.
Yeah, Becket winds up getting murdered in the cathedral by these errant knights who want to do the king's bidding when the king's like topped off his head and makes a comment that he can't control. And a lot of people blame the king for this. And the Pope basically says, like, look, you've got to make amends for this. I mean, you can't just go around killing the highest ranking clergyman in the country.
It's a bad look.
That. Right. So he donated, I think it was like a quarter of his entire inheritance to the temple. And it went over on a ship, and it stayed in the temple for decades. And Balian used that to purchase the lives of the survivors after the Battle of Hattin. You can look at it in a number of ways. We can complain about Crusaders. We can complain about their motives. We can complain about, how good of a Christian are these people. But without that donation, there would be thousands and thousands of dead people.
Right.
Who, I don't know how much longer they lived after the fall of Jerusalem, but they lived a whole lot longer than they would have if someone did not care to purchase their lives.
Right.
Right. So this is one of the things that I loved about this movie is it's not clean cut.
No.
And every scene and just him with the writing stick, and this is obviously power, right? Mm-hmm. I have power over you, and I don't care about your power. I don't want your power. I don't want anything to do with your power trip.
Which he is very consistent with that throughout the entire movie. I will give him that.
Absolutely. Okay, so Godfrey de Abelin takes this trip back to France. That happened a lot. Many nobles went back to Europe on recruiting campaigns, and the reverse happened, of course. Many nobles and lay people went on pilgrimages to the Outremer, not just for a spiritual journey, but for secular business as well, because the families were still connected, and there were nobles in the Outremer who were heirs in Europe and vice versa. So sometimes the second brother would go out to the Outremer and he'd be running things like a duchy or something, and then the older brother in France, he'd pass away.
Okay.
And then he'd go back to France to inherit that land because it was making him more money than it was in the Outremer.
Right.
Well, that meant, I got to find somebody to run this.
Got to have somebody take over for me.
Right. And so it caused a lot of chaos, actually, of how are we going to manage this overseas colony that has a king.
Sure.
Right. We're not even up to the forest fight.
Forest fight.
Yeah, I'm on my notes.
Oh, on your notes.
We're way past. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is one of those. There is an entire book sitting in your lap.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of things that you can, talk about in regards to this movie, whether it be as, basis, just the movie making and the skill involved, or, the historical component.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, like, this is 2004. Like, we kind of forget this now. Like, we invaded Iraq in March of 2003. Mm-hmm. So the fact that this came out in the summer of 2004 is just really amazing to me.
And that they didn't portray the Muslims as complete bloodthirsty animals.
Right. Well, that goes into the legend of Salah-al-Din, which we'll dive into later.
But in the time, it would have been very easy to be able to do it like that. And,
very.
They didn't do it, and they weren't forced to do it.
Yeah. This is a pretty powerful scene, and apparently this is part of, oh my God, when I was a teenager, I read a book on what it took for someone to become a knight, and it was this brutal experience, and it was kind of like this gauntlet, like if you survived it,
right?
Type of situation.
It wasn't just getting slapped by Liam Neeson?
No, this is the truncated form.
Yeah. Although getting slapped by Liam Neeson has probably knocked many a brave man down.
I don't care to ever get slapped by Liam Neeson. That's for damn sure. Okay, so Godfrey talked about the kingdom of conscience. He describes a tolerance between the two religions. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, that's really...
Three religions.
Three religions. What's the third one?
The Jews.
Oh, well, yeah, it's right.
I mean,
well, they're not very...
We've tried to get rid of them. Okay, before anybody gets upset... I mean, we as a human population...
Yes.
Talk about a group of people that have been kicked and beat and everything terrible imaginable for as long as they've been around.
Right.
It's pretty amazing.
No, it is. Yes. Yeah, I was thinking of the two that were... I don't remember seeing a Jew on screen.
No, they're not. They're just referenced.
Right.
Right. But it is one of those things where it's critical, as part of the story that it's a center for all three religions. And, yeah, you have no Zionists that are running around doing, god-awful things either. I mean, so presumably all three religions are coexisting, maybe not peacefully, but as close as it's ever gotten.
Well, in every book that I've read, actually, it says that the Jews actually preferred to be ruled by the Muslims because they had a harder time under the Latins.
Well, they didn't kill the Muslim savior.
No, that's
again. There's the fear of the internet is people take what you're saying as your literal beliefs, but that was the perception.
That was absolutely, and some people unfortunately still have that.
Sure,
perception.
Of course they do.
Yeah. Okay,
and this is about the worst cinematic part of the movie, in my opinion, because you have a huge event here, and it's sort of silly.
Well, I like the underwater shot.
I do. That is very, very aesthetically pleasing. But they wash ashore. It's just there's really no good sense of geography as to where they were in their journey.
Oh, yeah. Are they in Cyprus?
Right.
Are they near Acre?
I mean, heck, from everything you see, it's like they should be nowhere close to any lands.
Yeah. No, that's fair. And the thing that got me, and I don't remember this at the time I saw it in the theater, but thank God he still has that sword.
He's got the sword.
It's not even strapped to him, but somehow he made it through that storm with his dad's sword.
Yep, and he dried off really quickly.
Right.
And man, they've got good hair product back in the 1200s. 12th century, maybe.
Yeah, that's probably vino. Yeah. So this tolerance between the two main religions, that's really like a fantasy that never existed. So Godfrey doesn't mention the massacres that the Crusaders practiced when they took over the Outremer, or the Christians that Salah-al-Din had executed for trespassing on Muslim routes. And some would say that this is painting a tolerance that mirrors what the Bush administration tried to paint Iraq with after the Second Gulf War. Oh, look, the Shias have freedom now, and they'll all get along. And we found out pretty quickly that was not so. I will say,
but
after the initial conquest after the First Crusade and the initial conquest of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the establishment in the north, the massacres on the whole stopped because the Franks realized that they can't make money off of dead people.
Right, but coming at it from a story standpoint, you need it to be a place of peace. For the movie that they're going there to preserve this mythical piece. I don't care if it's historically accurate or not. It makes sense from a storytelling standpoint.
Right, because you have conflict at the end of the film.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So in order to have that conflict, you need to disturb.
Right.
And so what are you disturbing? This
idyllic
piece.
Yeah.
Right. Which this is idyllic. I mean, this is almost Lawrence of Arabia-esque, right? The dunes and Balian refusing to kill the servant.
Yes.
Because killing is not the servant, but the Lord.
But
because
the servant is the servant in his eyes.
Right. But it's not necessary. So I'm not going to kill unless it makes necessary.
Sense. Right.
I have no desire to fight. Right. And I don't want to paint the picture that there was no honor in the Outremer.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of honor in the Outremer, and a lot of the interaction between the Franks and the changing disposition of the Muslims that surrounded them.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that was based on honor, and I don't think that it would have lasted as long as it had they not had honor.
Right.
Because they had these agreements, which was, okay, we're not going to raid the caravans that are moving from Damascus to Cairo, and you won't disturb the pilgrims that are coming into Jerusalem. And that worked for 70 years.
That's a forever back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it was these assholes like Guy de Lusignan and Renaud de Chatillon who really fucked everything up.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. And that is true.
Okay.
Like any account that you read of it, those two guys
were jackasses.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we'll get into why. And Guy de Lusignan, I mean, there's a historical inaccuracy that I don't care about.
Mm-hmm.
Guy was born in France. He was the second son, but he never met Balian in France because Balian was not from France. And anyway, he was already married to Sibylla years before this. So a lot of people actually ask why she married him. Of course, she didn't have a choice. That was one reason. She was 15. But why did Baldwin choose Guy when there were better suitors? And that's a better question. It's probably because Baldwin thought that he had to marry a sister to someone he would pick as opposed to someone that he would have no say over.
Mm-hmm.
He had a say over Guy because he was not in Regency yet. But that was coming, and that may be why he chose. And we're kind of jumping the gun a little bit, but this is kind of essential if you're going to understand what's happening in the background of the movie. Baldwin was a leper.
Yes.
And from his teenage years,
mm-hmm.
they knew that he was sick.
Right.
And he became king, I think he was 14. And he assumed power immediately. So there was a regency, almost of 2 years, I think. When he turned 16, they literally passed him the crown.
Mm-hmm.
Raymond of Tripoli was his regent, who was played by Jeremy Irons in this film. And Baldwin knew that as he got older, he was just going to get sicker and sicker and sicker. So he needed strong men to become regents. Mm-hmm. And it was this battle of, well, Raymond is my regent when I was younger. Maybe he can be my regent when I'm older if he survives that long. But more importantly, because Baldwin's father was king and there's two other siblings, Isabella and Sibylla, mm-hmm. it made a lot of sense to find them capable husbands.
Right.
So that when Baldwin died, since everyone knew that he could not have a child, it made a lot of sense to marry them off to capable people and then pass the crown on to one of them. So there was this fight over who was going to marry the sisters. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, Guy de Lusignan won out in that fight. And there are a lot of people that think that if you just found somebody else, and someone from France who was more capable, and
assuming those people were growing on trees and available.
Right, exactly.
I mean, it could be one of those things where that was the best option at the time. Boy, you should have seen the alternatives.
Well, yeah, and I remember reading somewhere that there were less than 1,000 French nobles in Outremer.
Okay.
And so, I mean, that sounds like a lot, but when you take into a fact, okay, that's your dating pool. How many are kids? How many are men? How many are capable? How many
ancient
are
age of 32?
High enough of not just age, but wealth and status. And Guy fit that mold.
He was in that 2%.
Right.
Hell, he may have been the only
He may have been the only one, yeah. This whole sequence, this is part of that set that
was in the Better Pirates movie that never got made.
Yeah, it was planned for that, but they modified it. But I've always thought this sequence. You know, my brother's going to Jerusalem next year, I think next May, and I wish I was going with him. He's going with a church group, but I just found this probably one of the most compelling parts of the movie.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Actually, I really did enjoy this, and this shot right here. This was where I think I would have been much more satisfied with the movie as a whole had it kind of lived in this zone.
Yeah,
it's hard to define exactly what that is, or hard for me to adequately describe it.
Well, it goes more into his personality and his character and his devotion as a person and what he's truly concerned about, which is his soul. Mm-hmm. He is concerned overall with most things, his soul, and he's not willing to sacrifice that for anything.
No,
and he proves it.
He's a pretty stand-up gentleman,
right? And that may be mythical, but like you say,
for the story,
it's a pretty good story.
Yeah, it's a much better movie.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I'll take all sorts of inaccuracies as long as the story is entertaining. Okay. I mean, JFK is balderdash, but it's an entertaining movie.
Yeah, I wish that they had, I don't know, it would have been neat if they showed more of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and...
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I think would have made it
that probably would
an even better movie.
Another 20 minutes or something. But
well, we're in it for almost 3.5, it feels like. So, why not? This is one of those things that would have been, from the recapables, it would have been better as a 10-episode Netflix show. So, yeah, this is like the scene that I was talking about, where if they didn't have all of the members of his father's party perish before this point, would have made this a little bit easier to believe.
Right.
Like, oh, you're his son. How? Because you know how tall he was and what color his eyes were, and you have his sword. Okay. You're legit.
Yeah. And Jerusalem had been in Christian hands for 75 years by this point.
Okay.
So most of the nobles in Baldwin's court were old grandchildren or really old children of the First Crusade. So Baldwin himself was born in 1161. That's 6 decades after the First Crusade. His father, Amalric, was born in 1135. His grandfather was born in 1089 in France, so he was 11 during the First Crusade. Before that, it was a Christian city for very short period of time, because you have that and like we were saying before, the Byzantines and then the diaspora and then the Jews. So to the Christians of the Latin Kingdom, they're just taking back what was theirs, and to the Jews, they were just getting cast aside like we always been. I just had that written down. We already hit that point before.
Yeah.
This is my wife's favorite scene.
Why is
Orlando Bloom just, getting into the bath. Getting out of the
getting
bath.
A bath?
Yes.
This works for her? I guess she's a human.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did a lot of sit-ups for this.
Yes. So Muslims in the film are referred to as Saracens. Did you pick up on that?
I did, but I didn't give it a whole lot of thought.
That's not an accurate description, but that's what Christians called them at the time.
Okay.
And most Muslims called the Crusaders Latins. And that wasn't particularly accurate at the time. So they distinguished the Latins from the Greeks and the Armenians. So the Levant has always been this type of melting pot.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, in the 12th century, the Muslim world is divided. So there's these Seljuk Turks in Iraq, there's the Turks in Mosul, who are different, and there's Arabs in what are now in Syria, which the Christians have conquered in the First Crusade, but which the Muslims took back in the Second Crusade. And then there's Arabs in Egypt called the Fatimids. And they are bad news for the Crusaders,
okay,
the Egyptians, especially when their boss Salah-al-Din unites them and the Syrian Arabs. And this is why initially the Crusaders were so successful, because the Muslim world was very divided, and the uniting of that world is why the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem fell. So it's almost, they don't really go through it, but the 20 years previous to the Battle of Hattin, Salah-al-Din basically spends his entire time defeating his other enemies inside the Muslim world.
He's uniting the groups.
Right.
As best can be done.
Right. And the Christians were, until Baldwin's reign, the Christians were very good about keeping them divided, about having treaties or wars that had a very specific intent, which is to keep the Muslim world divided. So Sibylla of Jerusalem, Eva Green.
Yes.
Again, this is one of those situations where I remember the character from the first film, but when I watched the director's cut, I was like, wow, that's Eva Green.
Oh, really? She was that marginalized in the theatrical?
Yes.
Or her storyline, rather?
Yes, absolutely. You would be shocked. I did not remember her, like I remembered the character, but I did not remember her at all. She had no role. She had no role.
Basically rode up, grabbed some water, and was gone?
Yes.
Never to be seen again?
Well, they had sex, because you have to do that. But,
yeah. Well, yeah, it's Eva Green.
Right. And she likes these period pieces. She was in the sequel to 300, and she's done a lot of stuff from the ancient
But she was
world.
also in one of the Sin City movies, so I think she likes getting paid.
Well, there's nothing wrong with getting paid.
No, there's not.
No. Absolutely. Here and here.
Mm-hmm.
Your conscience.
Your hard mind.
Yeah, and so this is when he inherits his barony, right?
Right.
The barony of Ebeling, which was a real place in a real definable area that the Ebelins actually controlled. But my biggest problem with that whole sequence where he shows up with his barony, he just starts helping people build everything.
It's weird.
Yeah.
It's just, it makes sense, but it's just weirdly handled.
Yeah. The stupid Arabs don't know how to dig a well, It's
I didn't even look at it like from that standpoint, but I guess it's a legitimate point.
Kind of a colonial, parental.
Right.
It justifies the Crusader experience, and it makes a hero out of Balian in the process, and it's very demeaning, and it makes it out as serfs or slaves, which of course they are. It doesn't matter what religion they are. Even in France, if you have serfs, they're slaves. That's just what they are. And I mean, that's a white savior trope, and the white man's burden, and Kipling, and all that bullshit. This really happened. The Marshal of Jerusalem would execute Christians who violated the truce to satisfy whoever was offended on the other side. That happened. So, okay, Brendan Gleeson, great Irish actor.
Yes. And he's really good in this movie.
Yeah, Renaud de Chantilly, who is just a famous asshole, even in his own lifetime. And he was another one of these second sons who had come over, and he married the right woman whose father had died, and the inheritance passed to him to control, which was north of Jerusalem. And so Jeremy Irons plays Raymond of Tripoli, and in Baldwin's court, Raymond of Tripoli and Baleine of Ebelin were on one side of the court, and then Guy de Lusignan and Renaud de Chatillon were on the other side of the court, and it was like the royal family was caught in the center of these two warring factions. And of course, Baleine and Raymond were born in the Outremer, and Renaud and Guy were not.
Okay.
And so there's this historical perspective, which is that the fanatics, the zealots, are showing up and they're fucking everything up.
Right.
Which may or may not be accurate.
But it's logical.
Yeah.
You know, you see it a lot in story and in life. People show up and we know what to do better than you do. It's like, oh, this is going to work out badly.
Well, and that was a problem that I think the film showcases very well, which is you have these people constantly influxing. And, you know, I'm here to kill Muslims. And I'm not here to abide by any peace, right? Now, to a large extent, that's actually, I don't want to say it's historically false, but you know, the idea that there was a peace during this time is absolute rubbish. The Baldwin had been involved in so many wars, even up to his death. There was no peace. There was no truce. It was just a matter of they had to fight these people, then they had to fight these people, then had to go back, and like the armies crisscrossing the Levant is absolutely staggering. I can't keep it all in my head. But the Zealots did have this mindset and this influence inside whatever organization they inherited or that they were pushing in, that they weren't going to abide by the peace. And of course, Renaud's when he hits that caravan later in the film, that really happened, and that's a perfect example of that type of zealousness. Yes, thank you. Getting in the way,
potentially even overzealous
of a political rally that should not have been. You know, if he had not hit that caravan, you know, that was really not the first step, but it was the second step into a very bad series of events.
Yes,
which ended in Hattin. Look at that.
Yeah, it's very pretty.
I mean, again, like I think this is one of the scenes that was shot in the Alhambra, and I mean that's just absolutely gorgeous. And I remember something like that. That is literally, I think it's like 1,200 years old or 1,300 years old. Like the room that they filmed this in, and that's the power of Ridley Scott. You know, if Ridley Scott wants to film in the Alhambra, Spanish government's going to say yes.
Yeah, he'll definitely make it look nice, and he's got some stroke.
Yeah. Everybody wants to please him. I think the goatee makes this actor, the guy playing Guy. I've seen him without a goatee, and it's just not very impressive.
I don't even think I've seen him in anything else. I'm sure I have, but I certainly can't place it.
Of course, I'll watch Jeremy Irons in anything.
Yeah, he is really... And it's another... This movie has this same repeating thing for me, where we have these interesting characters that kind of depart with very little fanfare and aren't in it near as long as I would like them to be. Because he leaves before the Great Battle of Jerusalem, which I thought was just like, oh, that's a lost opportunity. You know, his character does.
Yeah. So, William Monahan, the screenwriter, they asked him why he changed Raymond of Tripoli's name to Tiberius, which is Jeremy Irons' character's name, and this is Tiberius, even though his name was Raymond of Tripoli. And he said that it was too confusing because you had Renaud of Chatillon. It was too many R's, Renaud and Raymond. He didn't want people getting confused. I think that was a brilliant choice.
Yeah, that makes sense. Considering there's a very small percentage of the viewing public who would say, wait a second, you got his name wrong.
Well, it does help distinguish it.
It does.
I want to talk about...
I mean, how many people were confused with Sauron and Saruman?
Oh, my God, yes.
I mean, it's like...
Yeah. Not me, but that doesn't matter.
Right.
Yeah. What matters is people were to begin
If they
with.
changed the name of, Saruman, it would have been like, I can see why they do that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad they didn't.
Yeah, me too, but I wouldn't have necessarily held it against them if they had.
So Eva Green's appearance here, one of the things that Ridley Scott had in his introduction to the director's cut was he really wanted to emphasize Sibylla of Jerusalem, and he felt like she got a bad rip in history, and she got a bad rip when they cut her out of the
as you were saying earlier. Yeah.
And it's substantial. It's like 35 minutes of screen time.
Okay,
that she's in, that's cut out, and her son too. And even during production, they had 2 scripts that they were working off of, and one was called Without Boy, and the other one was called With Boy, and that was Baldwin V, Sibylla's son. But in most of the scenes with Baldwin V, Sibylla's in the same scene.
So they got rid of that whole subplot and
right. Okay, so we'll drop that for now. We got to get into Baldwin IV, which is played by Edward Norton. Which I got to say, I saw his name on the poster, went to go see the film, left the film, and was like, "Where the fuck was Edward Norton?"
Well, I understand that he didn't even want himself credited in the film.
Really?
Yeah. I remember reading that somewhere, which doesn't make it true, but I believe that, it was like he didn't want himself credited because it would be that type of thing. It was like people, we're going to go see Edward Norton. It's like, where is he? Exactly.
Right, yeah. They do a very good makeup job, obviously, under the mask. Baldwin IV, by the way, did not wear a mask.
How unfortunate for his subjects.
Right. But I got to say, as a filmic element, very powerful. Yes. That scene of him, not at Hattin, but outside the wedding party, when he rides up on his horse in the desert to face Salah-al-Din, and he's got that ornate mask on, like, and the true cross is over his shoulder.
Oh yeah,
that's amazing.
Very well done.
Yeah. And there's the really funny look at his eye. They even put a contact in his Baldwin. This is some attention to detail in this film is like shocking. Okay, Baldwin was actually going blind at the end of his life because the leprosy was so bad.
Right.
So he could hear and he could speak with a heavy lisp, because the leprosy was affecting his mouth. But he was going very, very badly blind, and they even cared to put contacts in Norton's eyes to convey that. Then, of course, the chess set. The Muslims had a game that they invented. I think it was around the 800s or 900s, which resembled very strongly chess, and the Crusaders had taken it back to Europe, and they changed all the pieces to what we commonly now see as the rook and the bishop and the king and the queen, and to introduce that into the film.
So the Muslim version didn't have the bishop.
No, it had a different. So they didn't have yeah. Imam, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I don't know what the pieces were.
Sure.
But it was a common game in the Muslim world, and the Christians adopted it. This scene was missing, too. This whole...
Now, I see why this could be.
Yeah.
This one is one of those that's just small. This is kind of flourishes that does make the movie better. Mm-hmm. But I could see where it wouldn't be considered critical to the storytelling arc. I mean, aside from go to your place that's your father's, but beyond that, it's not critical necessarily. Well, I guess this part... Sacred the Jews and the Muslims.
Yeah, and to give a little bit of background there, that would not have been easy. Balian, of course, was born in the Levant, and his father was not, so it wasn't a really big deal. When Baldwin of Ibelin died, everything went to his son Balian. But the High Court of Jerusalem, the way that worked was because they had after the First Crusade, all the nobles got together and they chose which one of them was going to be king, and it wound up being Godfrey of Bouillon, who never would have had a chance to be anything but a duke back in, it wasn't even France. I think it was like southern Belgium or something. But they decided that the High Court of Jerusalem was actually going to run the show. As time went on, when Godfrey died, his brother Baldwin I took over. He was actually a very strong personality, so he effectively bent the High Court to his will. And that led the entire Outremer onto a path of success. Okay. And so when you're going through Baldwin I, Baldwin II, Baldwin III, and then Amalric, you go through a path of effectively personalities who die too quickly, and you go from weak king, weak king, strong king. Amalric, Baldwin IV's father, was very. He was invading Egypt. He was taking.
That's a pretty ambitious dude.
Yes, he invaded Egypt 3 times.
And persistent.
Yes, and convinced the Venetians to float their navy there, and then another time he convinced the Byzantines to take Alexandria. Like this was warfare on. I mean, for the Outremer, this was an epic scale.
Yeah, that's significant.
And then Baldwin IV comes along. So, but the High Court, when Amalric died, the High Court actually got together to ask, what are we going to do? Mm-hmm. Because they knew that Baldwin IV had leprosy. And at that time, what they should have done was chosen another member of the aristocracy to take over. Mm-hmm. But they chose instead to stay with the king, only because Raymond of Tripoli was available to be regent. And that was a mistake. What they should have done was and what Raymond should have done is, I am the regent until further notice. Because he survived Hattin. Okay. So if they had done that, I really think that despite Salah-al-Din's success, the Latin kingdom would have lasted much longer than it had. But because they gave power to Baldwin, and Baldwin had to constantly try to jockey, well, am I going to run it? Or is Raymond going to run it? Or is Guy going to run it? Because of that whole interaction. And the High Court just fell into those intrigues instead of supporting
any singular vision or leader.
Right. But what I was trying to get at, like in this case, even though Ebelin belonged to Balian's family, the High Court would have had to grant him, because he was a bastard, they would have had to grant him this land. He couldn't just walk into it. Mm-hmm. So they not truncated it, but they kind of simplified it by saying Baldwin is, which you will go to your father's lands.
Which makes sense. I mean, it is one of those that you have to expedite some things.
Right.
And now, do you really think, okay, so earlier you'd said where they presented this as, the white man showing them how to do things. Do you think that's really the case, or is it, because, I mean, they're all busy digging. They're doing stuff. I mean, as much as anything, I just kind of took it as showing his leadership, which is, critical to the character, right? And that he works alongside his people so that they believe in him, and he has vision and leadership, which, there he is digging a hole along with the rest of the dudes.
Yeah. Well, that's how I see it.
Right.
That's just a criticism of it. It's like Black Hawk Down. Mm-hmm. There's an article in The Guardian that calls Black Hawk Down racist because it's this white army that goes to Africa and starts shooting black people. There was one member of the Ranger outfit in Africa who was an African American.
So it's historically pretty accurate.
So it's historically very accurate, and he's in Black Hawk Down.
Right.
So
that's kind of when you're looking for something.
I think that's a stretch. Calling Black Hawk Down racist because a white army goes to Africa is like...
I could see where you could call it racist just from making the movie in and of itself, right? I don't necessarily agree with it, but I could see that argument. Saying, so you're making a movie about white people killing... Why? What's the objective?
Right.
And I can understand that, right? I don't necessarily agree with it, but I can understand that. But if you look at the story within it, story in quotes, because it's not really a story, right? It's more of a first person. You are there, getting involved in the action horror show. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, if you're looking for that actually being racist, like, okay, now you're just looking for something. Now, if you want to say, okay, you shouldn't have made it because this, that, and the other thing, I don't agree with it, but I can totally get the viewpoint. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It's kind of like this movie. It's like, why would you make a movie where the Muslims are bad guys or the Christians are bad guys? You obviously have a political agenda, and that may not necessarily be the case. It's like, no, I just think the story's interesting.
Well, I don't actually think that, and I think a lot of film is this way. I don't think that William Monahan or Ridley Scott.
I'm just saying people. I could see where a criticism like that would come from.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
It's like you're making this movie. Obviously, you've got a political agenda, whatever it is.
Right.
And that is usually pretty inaccurate. I don't think that lots of times they're as clever as we like to think that they are.
I don't think so. I think that they're aware of what's going on. A lot of times, I don't think that they fully understand. Like Don Siegel, to his dying day, refused any implication that Invasion of the Body Snatchers was about communists.
Okay.
That's what he said.
I believe it. I mean, yeah.
Right.
I mean, it certainly could be interpreted very easily as that.
Yes.
But, I mean, if that's not what he was thinking when he was making it,
right.
He's either lying to himself or he just literally didn't think that.
Right.
So why is he lying on his death, or is he lying, so to speak, on his deathbed?
Yeah, and so when it comes to these situations, like obviously William Monahan and Ridley Scott are very bright people.
Yes,
they understand that the images on their screen are going to be interpreted in certain ways, but it also might be one of those things of once you got the movie cut together and you put it and it's cogent and it's on screen, things come out which didn't normally intend.
Right, it wasn't necessarily the intent. Sure.
Right, and Balian being the white leader of the Arabs of Erbelin, I think just had an unintentional interpretation.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I'm a white guy, so, I'm obviously going to have a different perspective.
Right.
I'm going to look at it, of course he's not being like that. It's silly. I mean, of course,
Hey guys and gals, just be patient. Dave and I stepped out for a smoke and a flush, but we'll be back in real time so you don't have to hit pause like we did. Thanks. Okay, so Sibylla of Jerusalem, and I mentioned before how Ridley Scott thought that she got the short end of the stick in history and in the screenplay, and most of her scenes were cut in the film. And I wanted to go over this because there was a lot of confusion when I saw this in the theater, and a lot of it was cleaned up in the director's cut, and then again when I went through my readings. So this goes back to the reality of the situation, which is that Sibylla was born in the Outremer.
Okay.
And she actually had a slight accent, because if you were born in the Outremer, your French was not like the French from France. And some French look down on that, as they do today. She actually adopted many aspects of Eastern culture, just like a lot of the Franks who had gone to the Outremer had done. And then as they had children and their children had children, these people they've never been to France.
Right, doesn't mean anything to them.
Exactly. And so when I saw Eva Green like covered in hennas and wearing all this, I actually didn't know her relevance as a character when she first popped up in the original cut, because she didn't look like a Christian.
Right.
She looked more Eastern and more Oriental, and that was cool to see, but it was confusing.
Had no idea why I was there.
Right. But if you watch the director's cut, I won't say that it's explained better verbally, but it's her presence over time gets you more used to the idea of what's truly going on.
Right.
And of course, anytime you read a book on it, it's going to go into way into depth on the specific things that changed. That's another of my wife's favorite shots.
No, at the prayer sequence?
No, Orlando Bloom with his shirt.
Oh! Okay, so, I mean, it may be that I just wasn't as focused as I needed to be, but even with the director's cut, I found her actual character initially very confusing. Like, as to who she was, because when she was talking about this not adultery, and to be honest with you, I thought she was Balin's wife.
Ah.
Because, maybe it just wasn't clear to me, or I'm just not sharp enough, or whatever. So it took quite a while, even watching this. And I watched it, admittedly, most recently a couple nights ago. Right?
Yeah.
So, but it was kind of funny that it was like, it's still not 100% clear. And that was one of those things where the even longer version, which certainly exists somewhere, because Ridley Scott, I think he'd redo a lot of his movies if he could.
Yes.
Recut them.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. Almost as bad as Oliver Stone, but probably not quite as bad. He'd probably still add more things to it. Because I do think that this is probably one of those scripts that's maybe 240 pages.
Yes. Yes, this is well over 200 pages. And for our listeners, the general rule to go by is 1 page per minute.
Mm-hmm.
That's all true. Now that you say that, I mean, it does. but because we meet Guy de Lusignan in France before we even get to the Outremer, and then when we're in the Outremer, she doesn't spend a whole lot of time with her husband. They don't particularly like each other,
right?
Which was true in real life. They didn't get along. All of that, I can see how that can really confuse the viewer. Like you don't even know that they're married, really.
No, I mean you really don't get the sense of it at all.
Yeah. So when they have this affair, which we know didn't really happen in real life, but that doesn't matter because Balian is supposed to be a fictional person here. A lot of people, particularly in the first time I saw it, it was like a so what?
Yeah.
It didn't matter.
I can see why.
Right. So she's the sister of the king, but you don't really put it into the context of her husband is actually the regent to be, considering her child is underage and Baldwin has no child. The emphasis really should be much harder on Guy, because Guy is going to be running the show after this. Guy is responsible for Hattin. He's responsible for the fall of the kingdom. He's responsible for the Battle of Jerusalem, and he's held captive after for a very long time, and he is used. Salah-al-Din uses Guy to get the other cities of the kingdom to fall, Acre and Jaffa and all those places, which, again, like the fall of Jerusalem, not again, but when Jerusalem falls, it's not the fall of the entire kingdom. There are holdouts.
Right.
And Salah-al-Din's got to go from holdout to holdout to holdout, and he uses the captives from Hattin to affect those castles falling down. I think Acre is the only one that doesn't fall.
He says, nah, forget it.
Right. Now, of course, in the grand scheme of things, Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart shows up, 10 years later with his enormous army and reconquers 90% of what was lost. But that only lasted for like another century. And
That's quite a while, though, because I'm sure that, we're talking about time in a very different way, right? 100 years now is 2 generations.
Yes.
Whereas before that was probably 5 or 6.
Right.
So 100 years is almost an eternity.
It is. But yeah, when you're only living to 30.
Right.
Yeah. No, that.
Or 25.
Or 25. Yeah. No, that's a valid point.
So 100 years is, 200 or 300. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I know you know what I mean.
Yeah.
See, and it's still not even clear to me, watching it for a third time, that she's married to Guy at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest with you, when I watched it most recently, I thought the coronation was almost not the marriage, but symbolic of the marriage that had just happened or was going to happen in the near future. More as opposed to that they have this pre-existing relationship, because that's really not well established at all.
Right.
And it's not critical, of course, but it is one of those that it's one of those multitudes of things I look at and go, I want to change this, would have made this a little bit more emphasis on that.
Right. So Guy was not with Renaud when Renaud pulled this raid. It was hard to get Guy out of Jerusalem, from what I've read.
Kind of a homebody?
Yeah. And Renaud, this was a very specific raid that, Renaud was known for being an ass and pulling stuff. And you kind of have to put this in the context too. When Renaud was younger, and when he first came to, not Tripoli, the county in the north where he was actually married this woman and therefore became the lord of all of her lands. He was actually in a battle, and he was taken captive.
Okay.
And he was captive, I think, for over 5 years.
That's a forever, again.
Right. And it was not a happy circumstance, as you can imagine.
Sure.
He was of noble birth, so he had it easier than, say, some others. He wasn't slain on the battlefield or anything. But when he got out, he was so embittered by the captivity that he just had it in his mind that he just could not live in this structured society that tolerated Muslims and Arabs walking among them. He just didn't have it in his framework. So that's kind of missing in the story from my perspective. I think that would help the film.
A little bit of justification in that regard.
Why is Renaud such an ass?
Right.
Why? We understand that he's evil, but why is he evil? Right? I don't want a separate film about Renaud, but
No.
But Brendan Gleeson is just so powerful as an actor.
It works.
And
right.
he really comes across as this overbearing asshole.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would help if they added that information. So, but the caravan in question, how that was immediately resolved was Salah-al-Din cried foul and sent an embassy to Jerusalem. And Baldwin really took Renaud to task over it and said, you have to apologize and you have to return all of the stuff that you stole, and you have to compensate the families of the victims, which was standard protocol for
the time.
For an aggression like that. It did not automatically mean a war.
Sure.
And so Renaud refused and basically told Baldwin, make me. And Baldwin's enforcer was Guy.
So that's going to be tough to pull off.
Right. So going to Guy and saying, hey, your buddy Renaud, you got to get him to pay Salah-al-Din money for that was unrealistic. That was not going to happen. So when that fails to happen, Baldwin realizes that this crisis is going on, this split is happening in his court, and he's got to do something. And that's when he actually throws Paul. This is so funny. This is very strange. Baldwin throws a coup in his own government.
Okay.
To put Raymond of Tripoli back in charge of the regency. So he's throwing a coup not to put himself in charge of his own kingdom.
Right. Somebody else.
But put someone else in charge because he knows that he's too infirm to do it. And that works. That coup works in the short term. And Salah-al-Din, I don't think Salah-al-Din is ever paid. But Renaud takes a hammering after that. And is exiled from the kingdom for a while. And everything just kind of takes a breather. Everything just takes a pause. But, Raymond hands back power to Baldwin, and then Guy and Renaud just go right back where they started, and everything just slides back into chaos within a couple of years. So now that we're in full force in the Outremer, we can try to describe what it is. All Latin societies at the time were geared for warfare. Nobles resorted to violence as a matter of course in culture. In the Outremer, they behaved no differently. Not all settlers were religious zealots. Not all immigrants stayed. Some landowners gave up and went home. Some who did find their wives married other men. Latins in the Outremer tried very hard to welcome pilgrims because they were a source of income and tried to get as many of them to stay. But the ambassadors that the Outremer sent to Europe to drum up immigrants and money were looked down on because of their lavish lifestyle. There's a lot of things about the Outremer that we don't know. We don't know how many people were there before the Crusades came. We don't know how many people were living there after the Crusades took place. We don't know how many pilgrims came every year or how many Christians immigrated to the Outremer or how many stayed long term. But it was a failure because essentially the Outremer had to be a military state to exist, even though it was constantly at war. The aristocracy consistently failed to do this.
Okay.
They needed a homegrown army, and they never made one. It was always made out of immigrants, and it always relied on immigrations for its forces. The Outremer was a feudal kingdom, just like any other in Europe. The king gave fiefs to lords, and in return the lord owed the king knights and foot soldiers. In 1180, this was only 5,000 soldiers out of the 50,000-man army that Baldwin managed to field. Only Jerusalem was banned to Muslim residents. All other parts of the Outremer courted Muslims as tax-paying residents who were protected under Crusader law. And many Latin lords made local deals with Muslim leaders like Salah-al-Din in order to attract Muslim settlers. One of the problems of the Latin kingdom were Christians did not want to live with Jews or Muslims, so the kingdom was very lopsided. Franks tended to want to settle near other Franks, but in these settlements there was a form of legal, religious, and racial apartheid, which doesn't surprise anybody. But this was no different than anywhere else in Christian or the Muslim world.
Right.
Coptics and Armenians were always separated from Muslims in the quarters in Cairo and Turkey and Persia. So having said all of that, I'm going to quote Christopher Tyerman's book, God's War. Quote, to portray the Outremer as a haven of intercommunal, less interfaith harmony would be absurd. The Muslims of Galilee in the 1180s called Baldwin IV the Pig, and his mother, Agnes of Courtenay, the Sow. There were sporadic Muslim rebellions in the Principality of Antioch, where their treatment alternated between economic encouragement and extortion. While in some areas Muslims remained unmolested, in others they fell under a harsh regime. Syrian Christians and Muslim converts could rise in Latin society, but there were few non-Latin aristocrats within the Outremer. Muslims preferred segregation. Some disapproved even of that, but the mosques operated openly. There were even mosques in Jerusalem outside the old city walls.
Okay.
But the Temple Mount, which today the Dome of the Rock is like the second most sacred place in all of the Muslim religion, that at the time was occupied by the Templars as their headquarters.
That'd be a great insult at the time.
Amazing insult, yeah, absolutely. Well, I believe the rock is where Muhammad ascended directly into heaven, but it's also the rock that is the physical rock where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son, and God stopped him. It's the same rock. That's where Muhammad was when he ascended into heaven. So it has a double meaning. But again, it's not just sacred to the Muslims, it's sacred to the Jews, and it's sacred to the Christians. Right? And there was great cross-pollination of respect, despite all of this warfare going on, where, the Muslims had no intention of touching the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Of course. When
they took Jerusalem. That was not even a question. And Salah-al-Din would have slew anyone who even suggested it. But I've got a big problem with the shot at the end of the movie where Salah-al-Din picks a cross up off the floor because it doesn't belong there. It belongs standing up on a desk. Like, that's ludicrous. The idea that Salah-al-Din would take time to respect a Christian icon that's just cast away on the floor. The man spent his whole life dedicated to the belief that Christians are occupying his land and they, as many of them as possible, need to be killed.
Yeah, but in the context of the story that they're telling, it makes a lot of sense because they don't want to. They make a concerted effort not to paint him as a, mustache twirling evil bad guy, right? Yeah. Who, really, that whole side of the story is he's got a great reluctance, if not, an active dislike of the idea of invading Jerusalem, right? He wants to take it over, but certainly not through violence, right? That's the way it's portrayed. And his hand gets forced, reasonably so, but you can tell that the conversation with the young gentleman whose name I have no idea who it is, right?
And he says, I quake for Islam.
Right, and he's pushing, he's pushing for it. It's like, okay, Salah-al-Din in this story, he wants to capture Jerusalem, but only through noble means, so to speak. Yeah. So, he has nothing but respect for the people he has respect for, and the king is certainly somebody he had respect for in the context of this story.
Oh, undoubtedly, and in real life, yeah.
It was one of those things where I think I can see where you would say that, but I think in the context of the story, it makes all the sense in the world, and would be probably problematic with the way he was portrayed up until that point if he didn't do something like that. Just like when they're walking at the end, and he makes sure not to walk on the cross.
Yes,
right. And I don't know if in real life that would have any degree of realism, but for the point of the story and the way it's portrayed, it makes sense. It's consistent with his character.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you just after what I've read, like anytime Salah-al-Din could purchase peace instead of bleed for it, he'd do it.
Well, yeah, because it's much more economical.
Right. And that's the perspective that he looked at. Yeah. And he was...
Wars are not cheap.
No, they're not. And what I get from him as a politician in the Arab and the Muslim world is like the man was exceptional. You're talking about a very fragmented place where the Outremer itself was broken into 4 or 5 different principalities, and the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was just one of them.
Right.
And the Muslim world that surrounded it was broken up into 5 or 6. And Salah-al-Din spent a large part of his career just moving from one to the other to consolidate his control and power. Egypt being the biggest one. And once he had that under his belt, it was amazing. He wasn't even Egyptian, and he's running Egypt. He's a Kurd. So he's from northern Iraq. And I always found this is kind of strange because Iraq was littered with statues. Saddam Hussein erected statues of Salah-al-Din because, oh, look, he's an Iraqi. Well, no, not only was there no Iraq before 1926 or whatever, but Salah-al-Din was a Kurd who Saddam Hussein hated and exterminated with every will at his disposal. So I always thought that was kind of strange. But from what I see, the man was just exceptional. And I think the movie does very well to portray him as this very honorable man. And now I think that's also a leftover from the stories, not only from the Latin Kingdom, but after the Third Crusade, because Richard the Lionheart had fought Salah-al-Din in the Third Crusade. The personage and the myth of Salah-al-Din in Western literature for the next few hundred years just paints the man as this icon of truth and justice. And yes, he's not a Christian, but
he's a remarkably honorable man.
Absolutely. And that stays to this day. And we'll get into the fall of Jerusalem and something that he did afterwards, which will astound you. But it really seems like most of that, even though he was a bloodthirsty tyrant, most of that...
Who wasn't back then, though.
Right. Most of that was true. There's the true cross.
Yeah, and this is a very impressive shot.
Oh, I can't believe this.
And on the big screen, it's got to be quite remarkable.
All the flags and just oh my God, man. The dust, of course.
So that, you were saying that all this, well, not all that right there, that's a high percentage of that shot right there is CG.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty well done.
Like the front line is actually volunteers from the Moroccan military, and then everything behind it is a program that was basically designed for a video game to place characters in the shot, and so that they would have their own free movement. No, oh my God, we're so far ahead of my notes.
No, it's not a big deal.
But this scene didn't actually happen.
I assume you mean in real life, because I'm watching it now going, yep, it's definitely happening.
Right. Yeah. So there was a wedding. It's okay. So Renaud pulls off this heist effectively that even in Christian Europe, people were like, that was wrong.
Right.
The Christians in the Latin Kingdom knew that Renaud was an ass and wanted Baldwin to do something about it. So that's the castle of Carrick, which is in the Outre-Jourdain, which is across the West Bank into Jordan, the outer Jordan, Outre-Jourdain. And that was one of the largest sections of the kingdom. And Renaud had that. I mean, it was almost a quarter of the kingdom. And Renaud used that because of the traffic that was going from Cairo to Damascus had to go through the Outre-Jourdain. And so Carrick Renaud was just strategically placed to harass those caravans. And he just thought, these people are on my property. That truce was made by the king. I'm going to do what I want. So there was actually a wedding going on. I'm not going to go into the details for it. It was a fascinating story. There was a wedding going on in Carrick at the time that Salah-al-Din's army had actually come across it. And Renaud actually had sent out a message to Salah-al-Din to let him know, dude, there's the cream of the crop of the kingdom is in here. So there's a wedding going on inside. Please respect the confines of the wedding. And Salah-al-Din actually asked, which tower is the couple taking refuge in, because I don't want to
disturb their honeymoon
with my trebuchets.
Right.
Yeah, so he honored it. Renaud told him what the real tower was, and Salah-al-Din didn't hit it. This is an amazing scene. How Renaud is becoming penitent, and Guy is looking disgusted, and Baldwin just loses his shit. This is fascinating. And Renaud trying to do like a Christ move here,
right,
with his arms out, and just the acting, like the clothing, the blue of France. And how Baldwin didn't know that Guy was right there with him. Baldwin was not in that battle, by the way, so that scrimmage didn't happen. So a message got out to Jerusalem, and Baldwin fielded an army And I think it was a day or two out from Carrick, and Salah-Din's pickets picked it up and said, "Oh my God, like the entire Crusader army is on its way." And Salah-Din decided, if I stay at Carrick, I could take the castle, but I can't take it in 2 days. It was basically run my risk and have an enormous battle,
Right.
that I can't really choose the ground on, or retreat and fight another day. And he chose to retreat and fight another day, and Baldwin saved the day. So that part is true, but this face-to-face never happened.
But it is.
But it's very dramatic.
It's very dramatic.
It's very dramatic. And, I mean, just him and the canopy and Tiberius standing there, and just the litter taking him away. I don't know what it is about the Leper King that's so fascinating. But it makes me want to watch this over and over and over and over again.
The scene or this movie?
This scene. This is a rewatchable scene.
It is, yeah. Well, I mean, the acting by all the principals is tremendously compelling, right? There is a lot of storytelling that gets done pretty economically. Anything from Brendan Gleeson's character doing the dependent Christ-like thing to Leper King making him kiss his leprosy-infected hand. Guy's looks. I mean, just so much of it works. Not that the rest of the movie doesn't, but I don't think it ever works as well as that particular scene. And we're in intermission.
Okay, I'm just going to skip forwards to the... Renaud of Chatillon, we already talked about what a bastard he was. And... God... I'm going to skip that.
Eject.
Yeah, eject. I'm trying to find interact. So, while we're experiencing what should be the interact, I'll bring up something else that bothers me about the film, and that's the Braveheart-like supposition, if I can use that word, that Balian of Ebelin had a relationship with Sibylla of Jerusalem, and this is one of those things that just doesn't make sense. Balian was married to Maria Komnena, who was the Dowager Queen of the Byzantine Emperor. It was literally his mother. And she had married again, and her full-blood cousin was the Princess Isabella, who was the daughter of King Amalric, Baldwin's father. So she was the half-sister of Sibylla of Jerusalem. So not only is Balian not chasing Sibylla's skirt, he's married to a political side of the family that is against Sibylla inheriting the throne. They'd rather see Isabella queen, and they eventually do. Sibylla had to give up her claim to the throne, and her sister took it over. In fact, when Sibylla crowns Guy in 1186, Balian actually says, "Fuck this shit." He leaves the kingdom for Cyprus. His brother Baldwin actually was up to marry Sibylla, but Baldwin chose Guy instead. So the Ebelins were these huge supporters of the crown, and Sibylla's marriage to Guy really turned them off, and it split the court at a very crucial time. And Renaud sided with the king, who was Guy, of course. So... what do we have next? We went through. I got to tell this story just real quick because I mentioned before how my son and I saw Lawrence of Arabia last night. So we walk into the theater. I tell Luke just get into the theater because I don't want you to miss anything, and because we were running kind of late. I went and grabbed the drinks and popcorn. So I show up at the door to the theater, and it opens and it actually hits my tray and spills my coffee, which is no big deal. But the guy who opens it was like, "Oh, I'm sorry." I was like, "Oh, it's no big deal." And I asked, "Is the movie starting?" He says, "Yes, but it's just music. There's nothing on the screen." And I said, "Oh, it's the overture."
Yeah, whatever.
So he was like, "What?" So I had to actually explain to him what an overture was, which is they play the music before the movie actually starts, because Lawrence of Arabia has that.
Yes.
He was dumbfounded. He had never heard of that before.
It's not a very common practice.
It's not. And so then I told him, I said, "Just to let you know, there's going to be an intermission." And he didn't understand what those were either. I mean, we live in an age where epics are not...
I can only think of 2 movies that I can remember.
In your lifetime?
In my lifetime that had intermissions, and I may be mistaken. Because I want to say my memory is The Right Stuff had one. I don't know if I'm right, but that's what my memory is. And I think the Roadshow version of The Hateful Eight had an intermission.
Oh, did it?
I didn't see it, but I remember reading that.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So, this is the I Quake for Islam scene, which is amazing. Great acting going on here. So this guy who plays Salah-al-Din didn't know English very well, but he was coached on what to say and how to say it. I think he's got an amazing presence. He's a very popular actor.
I could see where he would be
Arab
quite
world.
the movie star.
He's got the face, doesn't he?
Yes.
Now, I find this whole scene kind of bizarre because Salah-al-Din treats this cleric like shit, and that's a no-no. And
You think he treats him like shit?
Yeah, I think so. And he sees God as somewhat distant and not involved too closely in humanity, and that's not really how a Muslim views the world.
Yeah, but I think... Okay, so a lot of the two primary leaders in this movie at this time, right? You have the king and you have Salah-al-Din. Neither of them are terribly religious people, at least not as portrayed in the movie. They have a faith,
Right.
but it's not driven by religion, like the cleric whose name I have no idea who it is, David Thewlis's character.
Yeah, the Hospitaller.
Right,
Yeah.
where he's regarding his distaste for religion.
Right.
So I think that both of these characters are kind of, not necessarily even yin and yang, but they are pretty much the same character, which is why they respect each other so much. So, I don't know. That's just kind of my perception of it. I mean, yeah, from a realistic standpoint, is it accurate? I don't know, and I don't care. But I don't. Because, from the drama standpoint, it makes sense.
Well, it does. It's just kind of strange. Like, this is a movie about the Crusades and the king.
But as you said yourself, it's not a Crusades movie.
Well, that's true. That's true. Yes.
We have Crusaders, and they're, pretty much anybody who is acting on behalf of what they believe God would want are pretty much portrayed pretty poorly, with the notable exception of Orlando Bloom.
Right.
And he isn't even so much as what God wants, but as what he thinks God expects of him.
Right. Which is two completely different
Oftentimes.
things. Yes.
Or probably should be.
I'm torn. I'm not just torn between the amazing drama of the film versus the historical reality. I'm torn between the portrayal of religion and the expectations in the film, and I don't know if it could ever be resolved. It's one of the things about the film that would just make it extremely fascinating. Baldwin IV really thought that God had judged him for some evil crime.
That he doesn't know what it is, but he just accepted that's what it is.
Yeah, well, and there were some claims that he was, his father, Amalric, had to annul the marriage of his mother in order to gain the throne from his brother, Baldwin III.
Sins of our fathers.
Right. So there was a lot of people who thought that Baldwin's leprosy was God's manifestation of that sin. And there's a lot of evidence to think that Baldwin actually thought that as well, that I have leprosy because my parents' marriage was not legitimate.
Sure.
Now, that's ludicrous for us to think now, but Baldwin went to church every day, was a very devout Christian. Here's the bastard who plays the patriarch of...
And who is that?
God, he's one of those guys.
He's one of those guys.
Yeah.
And I can't place him. It'll probably be later, but...
So here's a little fascinating tidbit before we get back to the main topic. So the Patriarch of Jerusalem...
and see, okay, this kind of mirrors what you were saying about Salah-al-Din, though, because he really disrespects this cleric.
Yes.
He really just says, and I'll confess to God, not to you.
Yes.
So that's why I kind of think of them as, like I said, mirror images, but not opposite. They're not from the Star Trek mirror universe. They're
No. The evil Kirk.
right. Yeah. They're pretty. nobody has goatees.
Yeah.
Except for, Jeremy Irons. Do you have a goatee? Not sure anymore.
Irons had a beard.
Yeah, this jackwad.
Yeah, He's got the evil goatee. So the patriarchate is like this very complicated thing that I'm not going to really go into, but obviously the patriarchate was Byzantine. It was Orthodox, and there was an expectation after the First Crusade that would be returned to the Byzantines. And of course, the Latins didn't do that.
No, I wouldn't think so.
They kept the entire structure. They just filled the church with Latin instead of Orthodox. And this, of course, pissed off the Byzantines. I cannot remember the scene at all. Was not in the first one. And every time I watch it, I wonder why did Scott even consider putting it into the director's cut? It made no sense to me. But
it makes some sense to establish his
Assholery.
Yeah. Well, and that goes back to, okay, and I'm sure there's one person who's listening to this still is like, oh, what a dumbass. Mm-hmm. But are Guy and Eva married at this point in the story?
Right.
See, and that's still very unclear because he's saying, oh, well,
right.
you've thought about me being your husband or whatever it is. And there's kind of this, not an implication, but they are never clearly established in this narrative as man and wife.
Right.
You know, they obviously weren't from a practicing standpoint, but even from a formality, it's really not well established in this movie.
No.
Maybe it is, and I've missed it.
No, I mean, I kind of got the drift. I did not get the drift at all the first time I saw it. With the director's cut, I got the drift, but it really needed to be spelled out. And I think Guy being in France in the beginning of the movie just confuses everything.
Of course, I also didn't have subtitles or the closed captioning.
You know what would have done it is if there was a fucking marriage ceremony somewhere before the interact or after Guy arrives in France. So anyway, to get back very quickly to the Patriarchate, the first king of the Latin kingdom, Baldwin I, he had problems with the Patriarch. Actually, he was like, I'm here from Rome and I'm not doing your shit. And so they deposed him. Mm-hmm. And so after that, the Patriarchate was basically the king's stooge.
Okay.
And so that's where I kind of find this funny that Baldwin's having this fight with the Patriarchate because
who in reality
very well established was doing everything to know. Now, the trick comes so when Baldwin, where the leper thing takes off. When Baldwin was a kid, his tutor was Baldwin IV was a child. His tutor was William of Tyre, who was a historian, and his book called the Historia is actually one of the 3 Latin chronicles of the entire Latin kingdoms, which is why we know so much about the events leading up to Hattin. Mm-hmm. He was not in Jerusalem when Hattin happened. He fled, so a lot of things are hearsay. They're finished by other historians. But he was actually the guy who noticed that Baldwin was not reacting when he was playing games with his childhood friends to pain. Mm-hmm. I think they were putting nails in each other's arms, and Baldwin didn't react. So William of Tyre was testing Baldwin's pain threshold on a different day and then noticed he wasn't showing pain. He was like, oh my God, it's leprosy. He was the one who diagnosed him. And then later on, there was an election to replace the Patriarch, and this was when Baldwin was in the very last years of his rule, and he tried very hard to swing William of Tyre to be the Patriarch, mm-hmm. which probably would have been the right move. However, Guy was in charge of the residency at the time, and he and Renaud hated William of Tyre. So the other guy got in. So for the last few years of the reign, it was this Patriarch was basically just doing what Guy and Renaud wanted to do. So that aspect is true. But in the film, of course, it's a lot easier, rather than switch somebody midstream, to have a consistent bastard in the same position. Mm-hmm. And I think the film does that fairly well. And then, of course, after the fact, it was kind of funny. Like the Patriarch was not funny. The Patriarch packed up all of his gold from the Church of Holy Sepulchre, and he fled Jerusalem. And he refused to buy the safety of the people who were still in the city, right? But he had trucks and truckloads of stuff.
He did okay for himself.
He did. While everyone else was sacrificing everything that they could, so to make sure as many people came out of Jerusalem as live as possible.
He was like, "Nah, I'm interested in number one."
Exactly, and I mean the parallel there is like I just remember another Liam Neeson movie at the end of Schindler's List. Mm-hmm. How many more Jews could I buy with my ring? How many more could I buy with my little lapel thing?
Right,
it's completely the opposite. Nice robe, yeah, made out of damask. Anyway. So that was the Patriarchate conversation. Where was it going? Was it Sibylla? I don't remember where the conversation was going before. Doesn't matter. Can we talk about Muslim representation in Hollywood?
Oh, we can try.
So,
I mean, there's this and there's True Lies.
Right, which is horribly bad. Like, great movie, bad representation.
Well, is it? The reason I bring that up, or the reason I ask it like that, is that it's been a while since I've seen the movie, I'll admit that. But there is a character who's on Arnold Schwarzenegger's team who I believe is supposed to be Muslim.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I haven't seen it in probably
right.
10
Well,
or 15 years.
there's basically the sharp one, right? There's Tom Arnold, there's Arnold Schwarzenegger,
Right.
And then there's the third guy, right? Kind of the nervous, geeky dude, right? And I may be way off, but my impression was that he was Muslim, or at least it may never be stated as that. That I look at it as like, because some of them are cartoon characters of
Right.
Islamic extreme, terrorists,
Right.
But I don't know if that's inherently awful if you do have some kind of counterbalance to it. And that movie may not have it, don't get me wrong. But it is one of those things where I'm not going to look at that movie and say, it's a terrible movie because
Because of that one situation.
Because of this, yeah. It's like, well, I mean, he's a bad guy. And I don't even know if that it's ever actually connected to his religious beliefs. It might be, but not that I remember. It's like, oh, you're just a loon. But okay, let's go back. You've got Lawrence of Arabia.
Right, which I think is very positive, despite the fact, Omar Sharif is in it. Omar Sharif is an Arab. He's a Coptic Christian from Egypt. Alec Guinness is basically in semi-darkface.
Right.
And so is Anthony Quinn. Right, but there's some parentalism going on in that film, but largely I think that paints Arabs in a brilliant light. And look what it did to Omar Sharif's career.
He seemed to do okay.
And that guy, Dr. fucking Zhivago.
Yeah, he was quite the heartthrob at the time.
Oh yes. Oh, Omar. Yeah.
So I just don't think about it too much. I'm not sure what other films, have got any kind of real. Well, let's not even say Muslim because that's a religion, right? Let's say Middle Easterner.
Yes.
Which probably is the incorrect term, but that's the one I'm going to use.
Yeah, we're scrambling. Yeah. Well, Cecil B. DeMille famously directed an epic in 1935 called The Crusades, which I have not seen.
Nope.
And
he doesn't get a lot of DVDs printed anymore.
No, he doesn't. But apparently that has every stereotype about Arabs imaginable.
Okay.
1935, I can see why. There's actually a book burn event in the film, and that crossed with the tearing down of crosses. It was hard not to draw a correlation between that and Nuremberg at the time.
Okay.
Right. So then, of course, there's this absolutely awful Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, which a lot of people lauded at the time because you had Kevin Costner and Morgan Freeman sharing the screen together. Not that there weren't Moors in the Outremer, but Moors and Saracens are not the same.
Okay.
Right. And the English would not equate them anyway. Arabs were very specifically called Saracens, so it's mostly a positive portrayal that I'm sure that we'll see again because it looks like we've stopped hiring non-Arabs to play Arabs. And then there's Art Malik, an American who's originally from Pakistan, who played the villain in True Lies. That's the guy.
I've heard of that movie.
Yes. And that was absolutely the worst stereotype that I remember. But like you were saying, it might be counterbalanced.
I'm not even, that's one of those that open to interpretation. Some people would find it not counterbalanced at all. And some people would say, okay, there is. But I just hate it when it is so... When something is stated as fact like that. It's like, okay, this is definitely... It's like, well, I don't know. I need to see it again, right? But I do remember this.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion on it one way or the other.
God, look at this scene. The depth of the shot. And this is when she checks on him?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is where he passes away.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think of other movies and...
Conscious or Nothing. I'm sorry.
No, it's Norris.
Yeah. Conscious or Nothing. And I don't know. This was a film that was released when there were new levels of intensity of feeling.
Sure.
There were fresh memories of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the subject needed to be handled with kid gloves. And I think that Scott had a tough time balancing that.
Okay. When you say he has a tough time balancing that, do you mean that he had a tough time accomplishing what you think his goals were, or you can imagine where this would be a challenge to portray it somewhat evenly.
I think before 9/11, it was very easy to put Arabs and Muslims on screen. And I think after 9/11, all of a sudden it becomes very complicated. And you start having arguments on TV. Like Ben Affleck got into one, right, where and I don't remember who. I think it was on Bill Maher, and Bill Maher was just trying to make this blank statement, and Affleck was challenging him, and and
that guy isn't a. Oh, I'm not even going to go down the Bill Maher. Fuck that guy. Holy crap. Okay, but go on.
Yeah, it's just in a very real sense, after 9/11, the Western world as a whole, and America very specifically, became much more aware of the Muslim world and the Arab world and its needs, its wants, and its desires, and its outlooks. And I think that Scott was trying to balance that in an epic scope. And I think in the process of doing that, he dropped the ball on the Western side.
Okay.
That would be one of my interpretations of what's going on in Kingdom of Heaven.
Okay.
Right? Like, just without Balian, just in general.
Yeah, you take that.
Take Balian out, and the Outremer does not look like a place that I want to be.
No.
Right? But it just doesn't seem like Salah-al-Din and his cohorts have the same problem.
No.
Which actually is not true. The Muslim kingdoms that surrounded the kingdom of Jerusalem were in great chaos during this time. It was Salah-al-Din who joined them all together. I am not an Eva Green fan, by the way.
Really?
But the way that she's shot in this movie is really...
As an actress or from aesthetically pleasing?
Just as an actress. Just when I see Eva Green's name on a poster, I think that she's a very beautiful woman.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think that she's shot very well here.
Oh, yeah.
And in the 300 sequel, which, again, I'm not a fan of that film.
I've actually not seen that one.
And she's in Casino Royale. Most people know her from Casino Royale.
Oh, that's right, she is.
And I'm not a fan of her in that film at all. I don't think that she's just miscast. I think the director got exactly what he wanted to get. I just
didn't.
I'm just not in for that ride, right? Even though I do like that movie.
Gotcha.
Yeah. There's Baldwin's.
Yeah, I think she's a strikingly beautiful woman with some really interesting facial structures. And Ridley Scott is going to be like, we're going to capture you and make you look like some ethereal, almost extraterrestrial human.
Yeah. Yeah. So
she has
Baldwin,
really big eyes.
She does, and they look greater with eyeliner.
Yes.
So Baldwin dies, and then his son Baldwin V becomes king when he's 8 years old. And Raymond at the time, does that look like Edward Norton, by the way?
No, not to me. It might be. Your opinion? What say you?
No, I say no. But so Raymond a
So is this all in the theatrical cut?
That was, yeah.
Okay.
That was the coronation was skipped. Everything.
So none of this.
Everything with the kid. If the kid was in it, it was not
gone
in the film. Yeah.
Okay. And that's really interesting because I guess it makes sense considering you say that her character was hardly in it because, like you said, she's in almost every scene. Well, almost every scene that she is in, the son is in.
Right.
Or a high percentage of them, at least.
Right.
So, and that's the most meaningful stuff for that storyline, their relationship.
And here was a great... I can't believe, this came up time after time after time after everything that I read, and I can't believe that it's not in the movie, and it's the coronation scene when they crown Baldwin V. Mm-hmm. They actually... So, Sibylla's father was Amalric I. So Sibylla's father was king, and then her brother was king, and her son is king. Mm-hmm. So she's a very pivotal person in the empire. And when Baldwin was crowned, she was immediately the most important person in the kingdom. The regency effectively fell to her, and Raymond's time as regent was effectively over.
Okay.
And so the patriarch gave her a crown and told her to crown the man that she thought would be the best regent as her husband and as the leader of the kingdom. Mm-hmm. And this was her way out. So at the time, Guy was actually on the out of the court because of all the trouble that he was having with Renaud at the time. Mm-hmm. And so, but he was at the ceremony, and Renaud was still in Carrick. He wasn't invited to the coronation, as you can imagine. And they brokered this deal before the ceremony of, look, we'll make the High Court brokered the deal. We'll make Baldwin king, Baldwin V. We'll give you the crown. You give the crown to whatever man that you think can withstand the regency and lead us out of this mess with Salah-al-Din. And she said, okay. And by all intents and purposes, the deal was that she would not pick Guy.
Okay.
And instead, what she did during the ceremony, right after she got the crown, was she called Guy's name. And apparently, half the people in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were like, "What?
Holy crap!
Are you serious? Like, we just had these negotiations yesterday about how we're going to dump Guy, and then now you just choose the same guy we were trying to."
You've gone rogue.
Right. So it was greatly upsetting.
I can imagine how.
Right, and I don't know, like that entire story I thought would be great on screen. That's a good 20-minute. Guy's on the outs.
Well,
Sibylla surprises everybody, puts Guy back in charge.
But under the construct of this narrative that's presented in the movie, what would be your motivation? Why would you do it? In this movie. I mean, essentially, she crowns herself.
She does.
Which is,
I just thought that was a great dramatic moment.
Oh, sure. I can totally see it if you know that whole context, right?
Yeah.
If you know the whole story, you could very easily visualize that into something very dramatic.
I mean, it does show the
And in the 10-episode Netflix, you could totally do it. But in the 3-hour, director's cut, still ain't enough time to establish those relationships and why that would happen.
Well, I mean, once that happens, like Raymond of Tripoli, like he's out. And the Ebelins, like they're gone. Balian of Ebelin's gone, and Raymond signs his only peace with Salah-al-Din, and he and Balian fuck off to Antioch, and they're like, "See ya." This is another crisis where the aristocracy says, "Listen, Guy, you got to do something about this." And then there's this massacre of Christians at Cresson, and a lot of Templars are killed, like 7,000 of them. And Raymond comes back with.
You think that's a real number, or do you think that's a number
they're all inflated?
Yeah, just to say a lot.
Yeah, it's probably half that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like Moses lived to be how old? 600.
Yeah.
It's like no, he didn't live, but it's like
old enough.
He was old.
Old enough. Yeah.
So 7,000, a lot of them.
Yeah, and Raymond comes back with Balian because of that transgression, and they get together with Guy, and this takes about a year. And I don't know. They decide. Listen, we've got to get Salah-al-Din out of Cresson because it's too close to Jerusalem, and we have to make the Muslims pay for the massacre. And that's when they start this march to Hattin. And Guy absolutely fucked up that battle beyond all hope. So here's it's I don't want to call it the famous scene. Obviously, this scene was not in the original. This is basically like a euthanasia moment. And I mean, I got to tell you, I don't know how I feel about this.
In regards to?
In regards to the euthanasia. Like, she doesn't want her son to have a life like her brother.
Right.
And, I get that. I just, slipping your...
So you don't buy the motivation?
Slipping your 8-year-old poison.
Well, okay, so I'm working on the assumption that this is a quick, painless death, right?
Well, yeah, certainly. And if you want to look at it from a clean-cut perspective, that
and if you're looking at it from true belief, where my son will go to heaven, then
right.
Why would this not be the most reasonable and logical?
That's very true. It's not suicide. It would be murder on her part.
Sure,
but she's not worried about her.
But she says in the scene previously that she doesn't want her son to live in a life of hell. She'll go to hell instead.
Right.
So I think
that's very persuasive.
Right.
That is very persuasive.
And it, I don't have any use for violence against children. It breaks me up. But I think that does make sense.
This whole fight scene was also not in the original.
I'm not surprised. Is the original? I guess the original is available.
I'm sure I have not even looked for it.
No, I'm just wondering. I don't think I would watch it, but it would be interesting to see. Ouch.
Yeah. I mean, it's very well choreographed, but I mean,
See,
also
are they
have
showing that he got hit? But well, okay, what is that weapon?
the mace, the triple mace?
Yeah, is that a mace or is that a Morning Star or what is that? I don't even know.
Yeah,
but if he got hit with that, he would not be functioning this well. I don't think.
No, no. This is one of those things where I almost like don't get the point of the skirmish.
Yeah, I almost don't either. That's why I was saying when you said it was cut, I'm not stunned.
Yeah.
I guess it maybe is one of those things where it's as simple as, okay, we haven't had anything happen in a while. We need something.
Yeah.
We need action.
Every 20 minutes.
Yep.
Raynaud in the cell and Guy's coming to save him. So we're on the road to Hacienda. So I know we talked about this a little bit before. When I saw this in the theater, not knowing any of the history, you had this giant army leaving Jerusalem to go to Carrick in the middle of the film. And no one said anything about distance or water or how important water was to an army of that size, which is kind of inherent.
Yeah, you would think it's kind of obvious.
Yeah, and that wound up being okay. Like, the army got all the way to Carrick, and they didn't have a problem. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the film, there's this other battle at Hacienda, and it's basically the same scene played out again, only this time water is an issue, and apparently it's hot.
Yes. No kidding.
Yeah. And I failed to see why Hacienda would be very different from Carrick. So in the original film, there's this shot of Balian like pleading with Guy and Raynaud, don't go, please don't. There's no water on the way. You can't go. And I was, where the hell was Balian the first time? And why was water not an issue the first time? And it seemed very inconsistent.
Right.
Because when they got into trouble, it was like, well, why didn't they get into trouble the first time? And since there was no scene about, hey, we have to have water, and the entire army is at this oasis for a whole day to make sure that we have water.
Yeah, lots of water.
It just seemed very lopsided. And it's less so in the director's cut. I think it's just because there's so much material.
Right.
That it does seem still a little off. So, I mean, we're not given a map. We're not given any distance. We don't know the time
that is
frame.
true.
It could be a different season. But the film doesn't tell you any of that. It just says, well, this time it's hot.
Right.
So, drink the water or take the armor off, or better yet, don't go. The whole setup just kind of looks foolish. But, Carrick was in the early spring. Hacienda was in June. So that's important. The film doesn't tell us that. Balian was also at Hacienda.
Oh, okay.
Right. So we'll get into that later. But the film pretty much has him stay in Jerusalem. So that's way wrong. This scene, this is supposedly Salah-al-Din's sister.
Right.
At no time did I ever run across this in any of the literature.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This was news to me.
Well, because this time they needed to make it personal.
Right. Well, that'll definitely make it
Yeah,
personal.
it will, but it's one of those things where it's...
Yeah, and there was a rape in that scene that was cut from the director's cut.
Well, that's unfortunate. And I'm saying that with a certain degree of sarcasm, like a lot.
Yeah. Scott just thought that it
It's distasteful and useless?
Yes, that's almost exactly what he said. Yeah.
It's like, it's got no value.
Yeah. But
and this is very 300-ish to me. Even though this predates that movie.
It does, but no, you're right. You're right. And Guy and Raynaud are just these giant jerks. And if they had not been there, I mean, Hacienda never would have happened. And I don't know. The entire existence of the kingdom, from its very founding, it was based on this aggressive military rule that had always brought the fight to the Muslims.
Okay.
They were very rarely on the defensive. Baldwin's father, like I said before, Malric, he invaded Egypt 6 times in 5 years, and he occupied Cairo and Alexandria for over a year before he ran into supply issues. I mean, that was actually something he could have pulled off, because 10% of Egypt is actually Coptic Christians. I mean, there's a sizable population there, right? Baldwin himself would be carried as a litter into battle, right? If he had to be. He was an aggressive king. And when he could no longer rule due to his health, he asked for certain regions to take over while he was still alive. And in every single circumstance, those regions proved to be just as aggressive as he was. And the film really ignores the rise of Salah-al-Din almost. Like, he doesn't really pop up until the second half is when you start seeing him really...
they reference him multiple times at the beginning.
Right.
But he's not a character that's involved in the action.
Yes. Yeah. And this is a pretty... I mean, this is a pivotal... I don't want to say pivotal, but it's an important scene when he's making his case for Hatin.
Right.
And Guy at this point is king, right? Because Baldwin V is... So that's the true cross in the background. The true cross was Salah-al-Din returned it to the Orthodox quarter.
Very generous of him.
After the war, yeah. The cross, the Templar cross that was on the Dome of the Rock was taken down.
Yes.
And the Templars were allowed to keep it, which is amazing to me. So what I have here is, I don't know where this is from. It says the problem for the Sultan's apologists, that means Salah-al-Din, was that before 1187, Salah-al-Din's military energies were primarily directed against fellow Muslims. For all of his glamour as conqueror of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, Salah-al-Din proved a cautious, at times nervous field commander, better at political intrigue, diplomacy, and military administration than tactics of battle or strategy of campaign. His successes at Damascus in 1154, Aleppo in 1183, and Mosul at 1186 came through the application of political coercion and diplomacy, not brutal assault. How is that a criticism? I think
I'm not sure how. It's like, he was rather a student,
politician, yeah. Christian armies defeated him at Montsegur in 1177, Forbalay in 1182, Arsuf in 1191, and Jaffa in 1192. I remember reading about that battle in the book. That was huge because Jaffa is the main port for Jerusalem.
Okay.
So if most Christians who were trying to get directly to Jerusalem came into Jaffa, and the Christians built a string of castles in between Jerusalem and Jaffa to make sure that road was protected. Indecision had cost him Tyre and Antioch in 1187 and 1188. Saladin's triumph over the Franks was eased by debilitating forces within the Outremer, for which he could claim no responsibility. Obviously, the Latin kingdom was having great turmoil when Hatin happened. And unfortunately, Guy mobilized pretty much like 80% of all remaining Knights, Templars, Hospitallars forces in order to pull off this battle. And I don't know, at one point I see their point of view. Salah-al-Din was helped a great deal by the divisiveness of the High Court of Jerusalem. But to say that Salah-al-Din would not have won, would not eventually have conquered Jerusalem because of it, I don't know. I think he was on a roll.
Right, well, yeah. Who knows?
Yeah. We're not defensible. So they see the end coming. There was a scene where Balian the siege of Jerusalem starts, and he says, "We're gonna save as many people as possible. We're fighting for the people." And that wound up not being the case. There's lots of scenes of citizens just being mowed down.
Right.
So Scott decided to cut it. I think that was
probably makes sense.
Yeah, it's like that scene in Starship Troopers. Apparently, when one of the big ships hits an asteroid. And part of the ship breaks off, and there's people flying out into space and dying. And in the very next scene, it's like, "Good job, guys!" The pilots, you guys got us out of that. And like, wait, so Verhoeven.
But in that particular movie, that makes sense.
Well, Verhoeven cut that clip of everybody flying out and dying.
No, well, I must be thinking of a different part because I remember a scene that is pretty much that. Maybe it didn't hit an asteroid
when Denise Richards is flying the.
I'd have to watch it again.
Yeah. So, Hatin.
The battle that is not displayed.
Yeah.
But it makes sense why it's not. I think it's probably more effective that it wasn't.
I think it would be like, I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's also one of those things where I don't know about you, but I've got a certain degree of fatigue with great masses of,
It's been 3
armies
hours of a lot of
No,
extras.
it's not this movie. It has been done so very much where you have these two huge masses that go clashing into each other, and then just becomes this chaotic, who knows what's going on, slashing, blood splattering, etc., etc., etc. It's been done multiple times.
And this is around Alexander.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's one of those that I think it's in this particular movie. I mean, the siege is more important anyway to this particular story.
Well, that's a good point.
So it makes sense not to actually have it just show the aftermath.
Yeah.
If it was something that had happened in the first half of the movie, then you have to show it.
Right.
But considering this is the home stretch as much as one has in a 3-hour movie, that it makes sense just to show the aftermath.
Yeah, I mean, everybody apparently blamed Raymond. Raymond was leading the column, and the true cross was taken in the middle of the battle, and apparently that's when everything fell apart. And
See where that would happen.
yeah, and at the top, well, yeah, I mean, they've been dragging the true cross around all of Palestine for 80 years, and it was responsible for all of their victories.
Right.
So you can imagine the spiritual or the morality of all of that.
The morale is gone, and
this actually did happen. Apparently, Salah-al-Din had ice trucked in from, not trucked, but I'm sure cameled in or horsed in from mountains nearby where there was actually snow, and he would do this all over the place. And he actually gave the cup to Guy to enjoy, and Guy apparently did drink from it, and then gave it to Reynaud, and Reynaud took a sip, and Salah-al-Din was offended. Because Reynaud he was of noble birth, but his birth was not as high as Guy's, and there was a Muslim tradition of you accept what's taken from you, and he didn't give the cup to Reynaud.
Okay,
he gave it to Guy. So when Reynaud takes it, and apparently Reynaud was being very rude and being a bit of a dick in the tent, which
that seems so out of character for him.
Yeah, which apparently, like, I can't believe he was doing that after he just lost this major battle, and the throat slitting apparently did not happen, but he was dragged out of the tent, and Salah-al-Din apparently, by all intents and purposes, did cut his head off himself.
Good times and the terrible times.
Yeah, back when it was acceptable.
Yeah.
I mean, this whole scene is just amazing.
Yeah, that's the thing with this movie, even with the extended thing. There are these little bursts that are tremendously compelling in it.
Just the look on Gleason's face. The slow-mo's not necessary.
No.
But
it was kind of Ridley Scott's style at the time.
Yeah. They tried to use an air cannon to blow the head across the sand using a pullback shot, where Brendan Gleeson would basically just like let go of the people who were holding him, and he would fall, and then the air cannon would shoot the head across, and you would just see the head roll. But they tried it 4 or 5 times.
It just didn't
work. Yeah, so they went for the.
So they just cut his head off.
Yeah, close-up shot of the neck. Yeah. But when I saw if you watch the features on the 3rd or 4th disc, whatever it is, they've got all of those
little anecdotes. Yeah,
those attempts. They've got the footage, and it's just you hear the air cannon just kind of lifts off, and this head roll by.
It's like we'll fix it in post.
Can't fix that for sure. So Balian and Raymond got out. Raymond was in front. Balian was in back, and they were leading their own contingents from their own duchies. And when everything went to shit, it went to shit in the center of the battle.
Right.
And Raymond and Balian were on the extremities, and they were able to break out of the wings. I mean, they were surrounded too, but they were able to get out of there. It wasn't an enormous battle. Like I remember someone in the movie says it's like 200,000 Muslim soldiers.
That's quite a few.
That's insanity. I think they think that maybe the Christians had 17,000 and the Muslims had 20,000, and even that, like, they think that's
pretty exaggerated.
That's inflated,
as well.
Yeah. And at some point in time, somebody says there were 1,200 knights on the Christian side, and the rest were just foot soldiers and archers. That's not hard to contemplate.
No.
So the Muslims captured the true cross in the center of the battle, and after that, the entire effort just falls apart. Foot soldiers who survived the battle were sold into slavery. 200 nobles were executed. And then the siege, which is coming up. This shot of David Thewlis's head is, I guess that's supposed to elicit an emotional response.
Yes.
Oh, so Balian fled to, I think it was Acre, or maybe Antioch. And that was one of the cities where Salah-al-Din had to go conquer after Hattin. And with the bulk of the Christian army gone, like it was just a matter of time before everything fell. And so if it was Acre, and I do believe it was, maybe it was Escalon, Balian's family, like his wife and kids and everything, they were still in Jerusalem. So Balian actually asked, he was not the highest noble in Acre at the time, he actually asked Salah-al-Din, do you mind if I pass through your lines so I can go be with my family in Jerusalem? And Salah-al-Din let him do it, which wound up being... I don't know, like, I didn't read anything where Salah-al-Din said, damn, I shouldn't have done that. But it is like 3 months later, Salah-al-Din's at Jerusalem.
It's like, if I
and he's like, what's going on? There's only 2 knights inside, and one of them is Balian of Ebelin. And I can just imagine Salah-al-Din going, damn it!
I had my chance.
Right. So he, Balian actually sent Salah-al-Din an apology. And said, can I stay inside the city? Actually asked him, do you mind if I stay inside the city and defend the city from your army?
Would you mind?
And Salah-al-Din said, yeah, sure, that's fine. That's okay. And apparently, I don't know who the other knight was. I don't think I ever read his name, but apparently Balian knighted every male over the age of 16. And there were very few of them. I think there were, it was in the hundreds.
Right.
And then he did the whole potboiler speech. Apparently that's real.
Okay. And
then he distributed them around the city until Salah-al-Din's army approached, and it was very obvious where they were going to attack. Yeah. And when Salah-al-Din's army breached the wall, it was very coincidental. It was very near the place where the first Crusaders had breached the wall to get into the city.
Is that coincidental, or is that an architectural defect?
Well, it wasn't the exact spot, so I think I think Salah-al-Din was looking for the weakest spot,
right? And
it just happened to be there, and just down from there was where the first Crusaders did in 1099. And that's another thing that I suppose is worth mentioning. Like 1099 was a bloodbath in the true sense of the word. Like when the Crusaders got into the city, they killed every man, woman, and child inside that city, including Jews, including Armenians and Orthodox. They killed fucking everybody. And Salah-al-Din refused to do that. There was just something that was just not on his plate for whatever reason.
Right.
We could say, oh, well, he's such an honorable guy, or he could have just said that's...
Or he was more devout, or it was just one of those things.
Right.
He was like, nah, I'm not doing that.
Didn't believe that it was necessary, but that was never an option for him. He got the city without having to expend the effort. And in the end, that's what matters.
Right.
This set is amazing.
Oh, yeah. It's, again, just another example of the movie is so close, but it's not quite there in my opinion. Not that I've done a very good job of illustrating why. It just doesn't...
I mean, look at that. I mean, that crossed the whole set. I do think that it's an epic.
It is. It's absolutely an epic by any definition.
And there are epics that fall short or don't quite get there, but they're still epics.
Yeah, there's a lot of ambition. It's a big reach.
Yeah. Luke and I watched The Ten Commandments, I think last year. I found it at Costco, like a huge set. We rewatched it. I am not a fan of the cinematography.
No, why not? Just doesn't work for you.
It's just not, it's 1954. It's Technicolor, which is fine. It's just, it seemed, that's when they really came up with scope.
Right.
Right. And I think
Had to fight TV.
Yeah, and DeMille was by that time he was in his 60s, and
boy seemed really old until I was almost 50.
Right, yeah, but he started making movies in the teens.
Yes, he'd been around a while.
Yeah, and I just think that he was struggling with how do I
adapt to.
Yeah, how do I use this format to capture this image? And then, like 4 years later, is Ben-Hur, and that's
an epic,
right? That is a very different movie in terms of, but they're both epics. Just,
right.
One just doesn't seem very, very well shot.
Well, and when you have an epic, those things matter.
Yeah.
So what else you got in the great book of...
Oh, my God. I mean, thank goodness the movie's almost over. What I do have is this thing I saw... I saw yesterday. Actually, I marked a couple of things that I thought were fairly interesting about the life of Occidentals, which are the Westerners who are living in the Outremer, the wedding itself that I talked about that happened inside Carrick, the death of Baldwin IV, but there was this great thing about the siege of Jerusalem, and it was about when Balian came before his tent, Salah-al-Din declared that he had sworn to take Jerusalem by sword, and only unconditional surrender would absolve him from that oath. He reminded Balian of the massacres committed by the Christians in 1099. Was he to act differently? The battle raged as they spoke, and Salah-al-Din showed that his standard had now been raised on the city wall. But at the next moment his men were driven back, and Balian warned Salah-al-Din that unless he gave honorable terms, the defenders in desperation before they died would destroy everything in the city, including the buildings in the temple area sacred to the Muslims, and they would slaughter the Muslim prisoners that they did hold. Salah-al-Din, so long as his power was recognized, was ready to be generous, and he wished Jerusalem to suffer as little as possible, and it doesn't say why.
Right.
He consented to make terms and offered that every Christian should be able to redeem himself at the rate of 10 dinars per man, 5 a woman, and 1 per child. Then Balian pointed out that there were 20,000 poor folk in the city who could never afford such a sum. Could a lump sum be given by the Christian authorities that would free them all? Salah-al-Din was willing to accept 100,000 dinars for the whole 20,000, but Balian knew that so much money could not be raised. It was agreed that for 30,000 dinars, 7,000 should be freed. On Balian's orders, the garrison laid down its arms, and on Friday, 2nd of October, Salah-al-Din entered Jerusalem. It was the 27th day of Rajab, the anniversary of the day when the prophet, in his sleep, had visited Jerusalem and then wafted into heaven. And then later, Heraclius was the asshole patriarchate I was talking about before. It shocked the Muslims to see Heraclius paying his 10 dinars for his ransom and then leaving the city bowed by the weight of the gold that he was carrying, followed by carts laden with carpets and plate. Thanks to the remains of Henry II's donation, the 7,000 poor were freed, but many thousand could have been spared slavery if only the orders in the church had been more generous. Soon 2 streams of Christians poured out through the gates, and one of those whose ransom had been paid by themselves or Balian's efforts, the other by those who could afford no ransom and were going into captivity. So pathetic was the sight that Al-Adid turned to his brother and asked for 1,000 of them as reward for his services. They were granted to him, and he was at once set free. The patriarch Heraclius, delighted to find so cheap a way of doing good, then asked that he might have some slaves to liberate. He was granted 700, and 500 were given to Balian. Then Salah-al-Din himself announced that he would liberate every aged man and woman. When the Frankish ladies who had ransomed themselves came in tears to ask him where they should go, for their husbands or fathers were slain or captive, he answered by promising to release every captive husband.
Okay.
And to the widows and the orphans he gave gifts from his own treasury, to each according to their estate. His mercy and kindness were in strange contrast to the deeds of the Christian conquerors of the First Crusade. And that's generally the judgment of Salah-al-Din, like we were just saying before.
Right.
Now, the knight and the horse, that was her son's toy.
Yes.
Obvious. What does that represent? Please tell me. Because I've seen this movie 3 or 4 times, and I've seen the horse go back and forth, and people keep picking it up, and they're looking at it, and they're putting it back down. And we know that Ridley Scott has a fascination with horses. We've seen Blade Runner. We've seen Legend. We've seen they do keep popping up.
Right. So what does it mean in this story? I'm not 100% sure. I think yes. I mean, you're right. It's been highlighted a few times, and is it just as simple as?
Oh my God! Look at that.
Yeah, that's very cool. Is it as simple as just a symbol of her son, or I'm not sure.
It's just something that my son had.
I think it's just a.
I'm nostalgic for my son who's no longer here.
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously important to him, right?
Yes.
It was his favorite toy. It was his whoopee, if you will.
It's,
Well, I mean, it's a stuffed animal, except that it's a horse with a dude with a spear on it. So, whatever you connect to, it's probably just what that is. So, yes, the Great Siege scene, which is pretty cool.
It is, and Troy is around this time. Troy was 2001, I think, or 2002,
somewhere around that same general time frame.
And you're talking a movie with, Peter O'Toole, Brad Pitt, Orlando Bloom is in that. He plays Paris, I think.
Yeah.
What is his name? Eric Bana. Yeah, he's in that, and really an opportunity for. And the director, wasn't that Wolfgang Peterson?
I think that's right. Yeah, I believe so.
So you've got all the stars lined up then, but if you were to say Troy or Kingdom of Heaven, no competition. Kingdom of Heaven
is much better.
Yeah, look at the shot.
Yeah, no,
and it doesn't matter if it's CGI or not.
It's really well done.
Yeah, it's very effective. And this is another thing that I've thought about really hard because, again, this is after 9/11. Mm-hmm. Try to find an image in a Hollywood movie of a Muslim praying before 9/11. And after 9/11, you'll have a lot. And there's one in Black Hawk Down, so Scott's done it a few times. The only one that comes to mind before 9/11 is that fucking movie with Peter Sellers in it, like one of the Clouseau movies.
Oh, I don't even know.
When he's like making fun of the fact that Muslims put their foreheads on the ground, right. And he rolls over on the floor, and he's just making a joke out of something to them, which is a very deep devotion that happens 5 times a day for a reason.
Right, but I sure don't remember.
Yeah. I remember it, and I didn't understand it at the time. It's one of those things where, as you become more conscious of the world we live in,
right,
that seems way out of bounds for me.
Yeah,
and that may not have been Peter Sellers' point. That may have been.
Oh, I'm sure it wasn't his point. I mean, it was one of those things like or maybe it was his point. I don't know, but.
Well, I don't think that he was a malicious man. I just think he was just trying to do something for a joke.
Right. Exactly.
But I think that joke looks very off color 30 years later.
Sure. Yeah. I don't have a strong opinion on it because
You'd have to see it.
Well, it's not that in per se, but the general statement is how often has the Muslim world been portrayed in popular Western entertainment.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any compelling reason for most stories in popular Western entertainment to portray the Muslim faith in any regard, because it's not as much of a component in day-to-day life.
Right, yeah.
So it's one of those things where it's like I haven't really thought about it because I haven't been portrayed very much, and I'm not so sure in most stories if it makes a whole lot of sense to portray it
at all.
I mean, how often do you see, people praying before dinner in movies?
Yeah, very few.
You don't see it. You just don't, because it doesn't have a whole lot of... Unless there's a specific point to it in that particular story, you don't see it a lot. And usually when they show things like that, they're saying, well, look at these people, they must be whack jobs.
Right. Yeah, red state.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
So it's one of those that you just don't see it a lot, and I don't know if, in most popular entertainment, if religion plays a huge role since probably the 1950s.
Yeah.
Where you had it a lot more often.
The evangelical movement.
I mean, you always have them occasionally, right?
I was thinking of Billy Graham and the whole revivalism. And that did creep into TV and Hollywood.
Yeah, but it's not in a lot of the stuff that lasted.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots of things going on here. Like, I mean, obviously, Hollywood was not founded by exclusively a Jewish community, but as time went on, people in the Jewish community seemed to have a hold on most of the major studios and most of the executive positions, and that went on to the 20s and the 30s, for sure. And Jack Warner, and I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah,
and that's. There's nothing that's surprising about that, but they were trying to obviously have a balancing act between they want to be observant Jews, but at the same time they had to be very careful about what they displayed in terms of their religious views in their product, because most of their market was dominated by Christians.
Yeah, but they weren't trying to make art; they were trying to make money.
They were trying to exactly. Yes,
so I mean,
absolutely
know your audience.
Right, but they were not afraid of cashing in. Like if you see movies like Hail Caesar, right, where it's very obvious of what's going on.
I've not seen Hail Caesar.
Oh my God,
that's Cohen's brother.
That's going home with you tonight. Yeah, you'll enjoy that.
Oh, I'm sure.
But so regardless of that, like films like The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, obviously very, very successful movies.
Right.
The 60s introduces not just the breakdown of the studio system, but a secularism that really takes hold, particularly the art tours in the 70s.
Right.
And the 80s is kind of like everything goes. It's just I think the 80s just all bets are off.
Okay.
You've got Back to the Future and Liquid Sky.
Yes.
Same decade. It's bizarre. And
yes.
People are scrambling. And I think in the 90s, in large part, they're trying to rebuild cinema. And then I think in the middle of that, 9/11 happens.
Okay.
And I think that reorients Hollywood's thinking pattern in terms of how they want to portray other people as a whole. Not just Muslims,
right? No,
not just in the kingdom of heaven.
I don't know, right? I haven't put any thought into it, right? So you may be 100% right.
I'm completely going off of bullshit. I have not read anything.
It's okay. I mean, that's fine, right? This is purely opinions, right? And
oh my God, look at that! Man.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Getting back to the movie.
Okay, so
this whole look at this, man. You take any shot in Troy and match it against this battle scene.
Yeah, it's not even close.
Yeah.
No, this is definitely the highlight. Well, not the highlight, but one of the highlights.
Arrows flying. I mean, this is, if you're going to pick one in comparison, the Battle of Helm's Deep out of the two towers. I think even though it's fanciful with, the elf flying across a shield and all this stuff. But
still, I mean, there's a huge scope to this. And I don't know how true to life it is, and I don't really care again. It's like, I just know that this is really well done, and this is pretty entertaining.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to hammer. I've been pretty hard on the historical inaccuracies of the film, but I don't want to hammer it too hard because when it comes to a battle, you're going to be very hard pressed to find out what actually happened.
Oh, yes.
in any battle at any in any juncture, even in Iraq.
But I'm just not sure on the technology if this is consistent with what was.
Oh yeah, well, and Scott got hammered for Gladiator, for the scene in the beginning with the setting fire to the arrows. And and it wasn't. It's not that they didn't set fire to arrows. It's apparently was how they did it with the oil. And he had people on set telling him, this isn't historically accurate. And I don't give a shit.
Yeah, he's like, I don't care. Does it look good?
Right.
Yes.
I'm not going to watch a Civil War recreation and say, oh, that regiment was on the far side. I'm not that guy.
Now, you would be really weirded out if they all of a sudden had AK-47s.
Well, yes, that's going a bit far. Yeah. This is a very cool dramatic license that in the end it doesn't matter how accurate it is. There have been a couple of times, like I remember going into seeing Braveheart, I had a working knowledge of Scottish history, and I was just kind of wondering why there was no bridge in the Battle of Stirling Bridge.
Because it wasn't that important.
Right. I mean, but I have to say, like the rest of Braveheart great. Didn't care. Saw it recently with Luke about last month, and didn't hold up too well.
No, I haven't seen it in forever.
Do you know if she really cut her hair for the role? Or
I don't know, but she certainly looks like she did. Doesn't mean it's not a wig.
Brie Larson in Endgame was obviously wearing a hair cover.
Okay.
And she bobbed her hair for Captain Marvel in Endgame. But it's obviously a wig because her head is just too puffy.
Right.
Right. Skull cap and then wig over it. This does not look like a skull cap.
This looks like it's probably legitimately a bad haircut that she, did. It looks legit.
It does. You'd have to go back and find, I remember when Mila Jovovich cut her hair for The Messenger, which is the Joan of Arc movie from the 90s.
Oh, yes.
And that was she was modeling during that time, and there were a lot of people that did not want her to model anymore because she had that.
Because she cut her hair off?
Yeah. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. Same thing happened to Natalie Portman when she...
Yeah, she whacked her hair for something.
For V for Vendetta.
Yeah.
And, I would imagine that would greatly affect the amount of roles that are available to her after that.
I don't know.
Which doesn't make any sense because the wig is easier to wear.
Yeah, that's the thing is I don't know. I don't know how much any of that stuff affects their ability to get roles in that. It may have a huge impact or nominal. I really don't know.
Just the sheer slaughter.
Mm-hmm. But, the nice thing is, for like that particular scene, I remember that, is that, they acknowledge the disease threat.
Yes. And
the burning of it isn't for anything beyond practical reasons.
Right.
Which is something that they didn't need to put in there. I thought that was an interesting touch.
Right. I'm little sketchy on my memory of Muslim requirements for burial, but I believe that it's a you have to bathe the body and wrap it in a white sheet, and it's got to be done in a certain amount of time. Mm-hmm. And obviously, when you're in a situation like this, you can't do that. Like, if that body decays, it could spread disease.
Everybody's going to die.
Yeah, it's a very bad situation. It doesn't matter what religion you are.
Yeah.
Just I don't know who did the costumes, but my Lord,
Well, did this win any Oscars?
I don't know. I didn't see any. You want to look it up?
Yeah.
It just seems so amazing to me. And the trebuchets. Of course, I don't know what the Arab word would be for them. And again, there's probably only 1,000 extras in front of the camera, but just the software that they're using to create the sense that there's thousands of them there is just simply amazing.
It looks really good.
And I'm thinking of films like, I haven't seen it in 30 years, but Gandhi, which I think sets the record for extras.
Yes.
Yeah. But there are no CGI. There's like one scene, there's like 12,000 people in one shot. And when you look at this, I mean, it really looks like there's 20,000 people in one shot.
I thought this was like one of those that was maybe the last time you had this huge group of extras. Mm-hmm. Apparently wasn't nominated for any Oscars.
That seems...
Because I always like throwing sound design or something.
Yeah. Name your top 5 favorite battle scenes.
Top 5 favorite battle scenes?
Yeah.
Ooh.
I have 5.
Sorry, we're going to put that one back to the post.
The post, okay. I've got 5. You want to hear them?
Sure, yeah, I'd like to hear that.
In no order.
Sure.
Spartacus, Gladiator, Braveheart, Enemy at the Gates, Saving Private Ryan.
Saving Private Ryan, which battle?
I'd have to go with the opening one.
Okay.
I've got a soft spot for
See, and I found the end of the movie one significantly more terrifying.
A lot of people say that.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought I was about the only one to be honest with you.
A lot of people have told me that. I prefer the one at the end. Like, I know the one at the beginning, it's all the credit, but the one at the end is really the one I prefer. Luke prefers that one.
Yeah, I thought it was much more terrifying.
Yeah.
Because at that point, you kind of have an idea of who some of the characters are. And it was... Also, you saw at the beginning how, okay, we're going to be completely violent and, take no prisoners
Yeah.
for the viewer. So it's like, okay, so what's going to happen in this one with characters that I now have a relationship with?
Kind of like this battle here.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God.
But even then, this is one of those things where, going back to 2.5 hours ago, I think if you had some of the people who were with his father's group
Yes.
who were in this battle, you would have this enhanced...
Oh, you're right about that. There's more emotional investment.
Right. And
yeah.
Jeremy Irons isn't in this, but because that's probably, I guess, more historically accurate.
Yeah, it
but
is,
why, from a drama standpoint, okay, if you're going to stick with that, that's fine. But then, get some of these other people who you've had, some degree of relationship with. Because right now it's Orlando Bloom and his bald buddy. And then, that's kind of getting the gravedigger from France.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. And then, the German.
Yeah, but
The German Thor.
Yeah, but he's been dead. But I mean, in the actual battle right now, that's some of the people you know.
That is a good point. That's a very good point. And now that we've sat through here for 2 hours and 49 minutes, I do see that would make the film more emotionally connected to the viewer.
We're just to me.
I mean, look at this. So apparently there is not one extra in the shot.
Yeah, I believe it. And that's got to be, 150 people?
At least.
200?
That just looks amazing. But you're talking about completely random movements.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah,
which apparently is what the software was designed for. It's kind of like Monsters, Inc., where they designed a software just for Sully's hair. Because they didn't want it all behaving the same.
Right.
They wanted all the hairs to...
act independent of each other.
Right. Jesus. Which is probably an appropriate response to this. But this was not... Battles of this size were not uncommon in this era.
That's the way you did it.
Yeah. They were uncommon in Europe. They just could not mass that amount of people in one place for very long periods of time.
Right.
And particularly in England, you had 90 days max to pull off whatever it was you were.
Otherwise, it's not happening.
Yeah.
But that's how it was done back then, to a large degree, I'm guessing.
And no antibacterial soap.
Oh yeah, nothing good. Yeah, you got cut, you died.
No tetanus shots.
No.
It boggles the mind. You were saying earlier before about penicillin.
Yeah, but it is one of those things that, a lot of it is that simple.
How many people had polio? A good quarter of the population.
That's tremendous. Convert to insulin. Prevent later.
So when the Muslims entered the city, they spared the Armenians who wanted to stay. They invited the Jews back, and they spared the Holy Sepulchre because Salah-al-Din knew that he could make money off of it by charging Christians on pilgrimage. All the Latin clergy were expelled. Pope Urban III allegedly died of profound shock when he heard the news, and the reaction to this was ground shaking. Europe had effectively gave up on crusading after the First Crusade, and after the Second Crusade had failed, they shrugged. But after Jerusalem fell, Europe freaked out. A lot of countries started instituting crusade taxes specific to the cause to permanently finance expeditions. And a direct result of the fall of Jerusalem is the Third Crusade, which 3 kings went on. Richard I, who fought Salah-al-Din the whole time, but he failed to retake Jerusalem. The others were Philip Augustus of France and then Barbarossa, who was the Holy Roman Emperor of Germany. So getting into Salah-al-Din and this great actor who plays him, I did read this paper by this woman named Miriam Pages, and she said, quote, Scott's Salah-al-Din displays a level of understanding and sophistication far beyond the reach of his Crusader foe. Whereas Balian asks the question, what is Jerusalem worth? Salah-al-Din's reply suggests that he realizes that a site can bear little military and political value while simultaneously possessing great symbolic significance. Balian cannot grasp this level of complexity. To him, Jerusalem must either be an earthly city where flawed human beings reside, or hallowed ground on which sinners such as himself might expect to encounter God. It cannot be both. By contrast, Salah-Din's far shrewder and more cunning character reveals himself more than ready to harness his followers' dreams and hopes in order to secure his ambition. Scott has made it clear that any idealized vision of Jerusalem has been ruined by fanatics on both sides of the conflict.
Okay. I'm not so sure if I'm... Okay.
That's a lot to take in.
It is, but I also don't know why she says that about his character.
Well, and Balian says in this speech, like, look, I'll destroy everything that's religious in this city if you come in. And Salah-Din's response is, well, maybe the world would be better that way.
Yeah.
There's no way Salah-Din would say that. The Dome of the Rock is inside the city. It's the second most holiest site in all of Islam.
Yeah, but
it's ludicrous to think that Salah-Din would say that.
Yeah, but that's not what that critic you quoted
was
talking about, right?
But she danced on the edges of it. She prefers the kind-hearted Salah-Din.
Right, which is fair. It's just one of those things where I don't know. I just don't have a response right now.
At the Battle of Antietam in 1863, I read a book somewhere where this guy said like, it was not an exaggeration that you could cross the battlefield and not step on grass. And that's what that looks like to me. You could not step on sand. It's just a horrible waste of life. So this chapter is actually called The Perfect Night. Like if you go into the chapter settings of the DVD, that's what it's called, The Perfect Night. Is that a tad pretentious?
Just a tad.
Is there such a thing as a perfect night?
Well, from a theoretical idea, I can't say specifically from an actuality standpoint.
From their standpoint, there is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess, for purposes of this, he was. Because he did what was ordered of him when he was knighted.
Right.
He protected the innocent. Fought the good fight.
That kingdom can never be surrendered. The kingdom of conscience, I guess he's referring to. Historian Kathleen Biddick said this film was under unbearable pressure of contemporary politics. She called the defense of Jerusalem a fantasy scenario. Crusader historian Jonathan Riley Smith accused the film of representing Osama bin Laden's version of history. The Village Voice declared it, quote, fascist or at least newly Riefenstahlian in its perspective, unquote.
I don't understand.
They think that they're giving Muslims a complete pass, that they're not nearly portrayed as aggressive.
Well, I mean, I got that from the first one,
yeah,
but not the second one. Or was that all a single quote from a single review? The fascist part.
Yes, the single quote from a single review. Yeah, just it was one person who was summing up. So
okay, I thought that was two separate quotes. Okay,
yeah. So, the confrontation between Balian and Guy.
I forgot about this part.
Yeah, this was not in the first version either. Just ignore that. That's the ending.
Oh,
ending music, which I'm gonna have to push to a little farther.
Yeah, that's no problem. So this is 2 hours and 57 minutes in. This is an incredibly long movie.
It is. But it's, I mean, we found a couple of scenes that we could do without.
Yeah, no, I couldn't imagine it being much shorter and being even close to watchable, that's for sure.
Yeah, maybe 15, 20 minutes.
Maybe.
Right, but
I couldn't even tell you what it would necessarily be beyond that. There was like the one scene, it's like, okay, you could probably get rid of that. That doesn't have a whole lot of value, but even then, I don't know that.
I don't even know if this scene is necessary.
No, I don't think this one is.
I mean, I don't know. Guy went to...
He gets his comeuppance. That always matters.
Right. Yeah,
but I don't know if it was really if it was gone, if I'd have been, oh, they should have had this part.
Yeah, he was ransomed. Guy was. That's how he got back. So Salah-al-Din allowed him to be ransomed, and then he made a deal to go to Cyprus, and he took Sibylla with him. So I know this is going to shock you, but Sibylla didn't go back to France with Balian.
Really?
Yes.
No, what?
Balian was actually married to another woman, which we talked about before. Yeah.
But again, not dramatically satisfying.
Yeah. And I mean, this actually is a fairly emotional scene. I thought this was very well done with the blood on the banners, and then Salah-al-Din. And the Muslims as a whole, who see Jerusalem just as holy as the rest of Christendom, and they have an emotional feeling when they enter the city. Here's the scene that I've got a problem with. Let me pick up this cross and set it here. So the historian who was on the set asked this actor, "Why did you do that?" He said, "It's because that's what Salah-al-Din would have done."
Okay.
I have a hard time believing that Salah-al-Din would take 30 seconds out of his day to pick up a Christian symbol off the floor and put it on the table.
Well, I think the Salah-al-Din in the movie, it makes sense. Again, it was one of those where, this movie goes out of its way to show respect and all that to the different beliefs and cultures, right? I mean, that's kind of basically the point of the movie, right? Right. So it's totally in line with the way the character has been portrayed. If this was a totally fictional story,
it's consistent.
Yeah, it's like, okay, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Now, you're saying the historical.
Right, yeah. And, historians... I mean, I don't have this problem, but just historians in general, they just don't like people...
fucking with history.
Right, yeah. And I get that. At the same time, like I am obviously a huge film fan, and I don't mind it so much.
It really kind of depends on what they do, right?
Right. Like, I'm less interested in Balian and not being married and the whole love triangle,
right?
And I'm more concerned with the what is the film trying to say? What is the film trying to mean?
And then the primary events, like
walking this was around the cross instead of on top of it.
Yeah, but if this was one of those things where in the movie, they had successfully driven back the Muslim hordes and retained Jerusalem, you probably have a problem with that.
Yes.
Because, that is a major veer from reality.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
But those little things are details, and they're color and nuance.
I did read a lot of reviews by a lot of people who complained about Salah-al-Din's character and called it, a whitewashing of terrorism and all this other bullshit. And I really don't see that. Salah-al-Din has always been seen as an honorable man.
Right. But it's also one of those things where, like you were saying, take it in the context of its era. It came out 4 years after, 9/11. And it's like, hey, as much as it's not very polite to say, there is a certain percentage of Islamic,
terrorists
who want to kill us all.
Yes. The jihadis.
And there's not a lot of them, right? That's not a very high percentage.
No.
That's like saying every white male is going to be a mass murderer with a machine gun.
Right.
It's like, no, but boy, there seems to be a lot of them recently.
Sure. Especially in this state.
Only 2 in the state.
Only 2 in the state?
I can think of off the top of my head because, it's the past month.
Well, 2 in this past month.
Yeah.
There was a large one that was right down the road just last year.
Yeah, yeah.
So, anyway. I'm not going to...
For the movie itself.
For the movie
it
itself.
Makes sense.
So, I mean, I actually, again, don't have a problem with... There's plenty of historical movies that veer off the beaten path. Balian taking Sibylla back to France, I understand why Ridley Scott would want that to happen.
Yes.
That makes complete sense from a story
Because it redeems both the characters.
Yes. Yes.
Well, maybe it doesn't redeem them, but at least...
And considering this Balian is supposed to be mostly fictional, I get it. It just... Sibylla didn't go back to France. She'd never been to France. She went to Cyprus with Guy. So that seems pretty inconsistent with me.
Right.
So I was pretty shocked. The theatrical, he's not even in France. He just leaves the Holy Land and credits.
Which would make a lot of sense,
It would make a whole lot more sense than this does, for sure. And here we are thinking, man, I don't know if we can talk for 3 hours of this movie, but we seem to fill it up quite well.
Well, I suppose you're right. You had a lot of stuff to go through there, though. What percentage of your book were you able to grind through?
Well, the rest of these are just academic papers. I mean, it's only a couple. Another thing that I don't understand is, why is Balian allowed back in this village? Isn't he a wanted murderer? So
he went down and he
purged his. He's forgiven.
Well, and who else?
He went to the Holy Land.
Yeah, and also
right? Here's King Richard.
It's the Middle Ages. Also, it's like, everybody who remembered him ought to be dead from some kind of plague.
Yeah,
and it's disappointing that it's not, Sean Connery.
So here's something else that I got from the same source. The tragically passive heroine of Kingdom of Heaven contrasts jarringly with the historical Sibylla, a figure presented by contemporary historians as a strong, willful woman capable of deceiving the Eastern barons in her attempt to control her own personal as well as political destiny. By depicting a historical figure with a relatively well-recorded life and altering that a historical narrative so drastically, Kingdom of Heaven indirectly contributes to a larger conversation about women in the Middle Ages and today. Through its substitution of a lost damsel in distress for historically strong female ruler, the film is in fact reinforcing several hegemonic narratives about women. Sibylla's political actions are erased, and her fictional persona possesses little to no actual agency. By silencing Sibylla's historical voice, the film is therefore suggesting that women cannot act or even fully exist without men. Now, I would say here that this was written about the original release.
Okay.
And this version, like we talked about before, there's 45 minutes of Sibylla put back into the movie.
Right.
So I would disagree with this. I think that it focuses a lot on her character.
Yeah, but yes, I agree with you. And she does display an ability to be agile and nimble and strong and all of that. Maybe it doesn't accurately represent her accomplishments in that time frame. I don't know.
Well, she does seem like she's flailing around a little bit, like trying to grasp hold of, what do I do with my child, with my brother, with my husband?
Seems very reasonable under the circumstances.
Right. Yeah, she looks like a woman who was put in an impossible position.
Yes. With
those problems and surrounded by the entire Muslim world. Everybody was in a tough situation.
And everybody was just a bunch of jerks.
Yeah, well, particularly her husband. Yeah. So there are some questions, and then we'll wrap up real quick. Yeah. Okay. So,
my ear.
Does the production... Okay, I read a compelling essay by historian Dawn Hayes in which she posited a number of questions about Kingdom of Heaven that I thought was relevant. Mm-hmm. So I want to review some of them.
Okay.
Does the production appear to be historically accurate? Generally speaking, there's a few things that are off here and there, but I think so.
I can't have an opinion of it because I didn't do all the research that you did, but it doesn't strike me as something that is egregiously out of reality.
Well, like you were saying, the fall of Jerusalem is true. The Battle of Hattin is true. I mean, there are characters doing side steps, but Salah-al-Din's character seems to be intact.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if it is not historically accurate, why did the filmmakers make such changes? Well, I think that goes back to your point earlier about dramatic license.
Yeah, you got to tell a story.
Yeah,
right. And it's one of those things you can't include every single detail. You have to do whatever makes the most amount of sense to be able to accomplish your story in the time frame you got.
Yeah, which is 3 hours and 8 minutes. Why is Balian different? He was born in the Holy Land and was 40 at the time this happened. Well, I mean, again, that's dramatic license. That doesn't bother me. Why is there only one church in the entire movie about the kingdom of heaven?
Good question.
I think that's a valid question.
Pretty good question.
I mean,
unless it's one of those things where you're taking it as a rejection of religion and an embracement of faith.
Well, okay. So I read a lot of stuff about people who were calling it trash because it rejected religion as a whole. But I take your point where it might be a rejection of organized religion, but it might be the embracing of a faith that actually does something for you. I have a hard time knocking that at all.
I do too. Yeah. Concur.
Yeah. Okay. Baldwin is dead by the time Balian comes to the Outremer. Why? I don't catch that one.
I'm not sure what
Baldwin is dead by the time Balian comes to the Outremer. That's not accurate in the movie.
Was this a question that you had?
This was a question that she posted in her that she commented in her paper.
Maybe she's wrong.
And then she says, "Are we being deliberately manipulated?" Well,
of course we're getting
we are.
I mean, yeah.
You don't want to be manipulated to go see a movie.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, that's okay, yeah.
All right, academic, not a film critic. Okay. Well, I think that's it. Do you have any final thoughts about the Kingdom of Heaven?
You know what? I don't. I'm sorry.
I
just don't. I just don't. I'm sorry I don't have a whole lot of passion for this movie. So I just don't.
And yet you recommended it.
Yeah, because I thought it would be very interesting for you.
Well, that's certainly true.
That was kind of it.
I've spent more time researching this podcast than any other project.
Like I said, I knew this would be interesting for you.
Yeah. But I really enjoyed having you over to talk about it.
That's not a problem at all. I, of course, will do that. That's not an issue. But I can't wax poetic on the Kingdom of Heaven.
You've done a pretty good job. Okay.
All right.
So, thanks for hanging out with me and Dave while we watch The Kingdom of Heaven. He'll be back for future editions of the Super 70 podcast. You can find it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and my website at www.thatdylandavis.com. All music on this podcast was written and recorded by Rosalind McPhail. You can reach her on Twitter and SoundCloud.com. If you're offended by the interpretation of this film, please let me know by sending me an email at thatdylandavis@gmail.com. If you like the podcast, please express this on iTunes, Google Play, or SoundCloud by leaving a rating and a review. You can also find me on Twitter at thatdylandavis and my books on Amazon.com. This is Dylan Davis, and still, we'll meet next time at Harvard University.